Yo creo. Yo los invité a todos. Para todos, para todos. Sí. A la que van a venir más es mañana porque es la hora de mi clase. Entonces empezamos, doctora. Okay. Well, good morning to everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this fourth International Colloquium on African Studies, organized by the University Program of African and Asian Studies. As I said, I'm very happy to welcome you here and to welcome our guest speaker, Howard Stein, that comes from the US to give this keynote lecture. And I think this, I'm very happy personally to be here once again, organizing this event, the fourth one. And I think that African studies here in Latin America are getting stronger and stronger. And even though that this room is a little bit empty today, it's because of the time, I think also. But I think that there's a growing interest, and a growing interest also in assessing the place of Africa, African countries, African societies, African dynamics in the international system. We are used to conceive Africa as a peripheral actor in the international system, and we should shift from that point of view to placing it in the center of our analysis, so that disciplines such as international relations can grow from another perspective, of analytical perspective. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker of this morning. So Howard Stein is a professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan. He is a development economist educated in Canada, the US, and the UK. He has published more than a dozen books and edited collections and more than 150 journal articles, book chapters, and reviews. He has held various academic appointments at places like the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Hitotsubashi University at Japan, Sussex University at the UK, Trinity College in Ireland, University of Lisbon in Portugal, and University of Leiden in the Netherlands. He has undertaken research in a variety of African countries on topics like foreign aid, World Bank and IMF lending, finance and banking, neoliberalism, the methodology of randomized controlled trials, health and gender, climate change, industrial policy, export processing zones, agricultural policy, African overpayment on sovereign bond issues, poverty and rural property right transformation, income inequality, Chinese economic relations, and the institutionalization of neoclassical economics. So you can see that his research covers a lot of topics. So I lend you the floor is yours, Dr. Stein, and we are very pleased to have you here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. It just means that I get bored easily on a subject, so I move to another one. Basically, I want to really thank the Estudios sobre Asia Africa. I'm sorry I don't speak much Spanish, poquito. But I also want to thank Alethia, who's an old friend. We've been on panels many together. She should be up here with me, I think, and knows as much about this subject as I do. And also Vania de la Vega, who the secretary who arranged everything and put a lot of good work into it. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's taken me a long time to get to Mexico City, my first visit, and it's a beautiful campus, it looks like, having driven through quickly to get here. Today I'm going to cover, I want to very much focus on the issue of Africa and financial flows because it's so central, as I'll explain, but I can't sort of take this moment to look at this moment, to examine these extraordinary Trump's tariffs that have been placed in the world with huge consequences to sub-Saharan Africa, Africa in general. And so I'm going to start by introduction, basically talking very briefly about multipolarity, which is anybody who's a linguist knows it's a bit of an oxymoron, because multipolarity, basically, polarity itself is always comes in pairs, opposed but equivalent. Polarity, by definition, is the state of having two opposite or contradictory tendencies or opinions. But we know in popular jargon that's come to discuss the issues of power and nodes of power and concentration. We have this focus on the unipolarity, domination of the world by one power, bipolarity, the two major powers, and then multipolarity. A world in its formal definition characterized by existence of multiple centers of power without one particular power being dominant. But in the real world, of course, polarity is a continuum. And there's enormous variabilities of the degree of power among different players, and a great deal of asymmetric power relationships that are always embedded in each of these poles within the world. And there's always, within this context, the duality of both domination and subordination. I'll talk about that in the financial field, which is so crucial. To complicate things even further, there are all sorts of different spheres of domination. It covers military, production, trade, wealth, income, science, technology, education, culture, language, political systems, and of course, to complicate things even more significantly than that, it also means interaction of all these spheres. So it's a kind of complicated world. If we took at the closest thing to unipolarity, we'd really have to talk about United States and the military, because the United States basically spends 40% of the world's global expenditures on the military, and it's equal to the next 9 countries' expenditures on the military. But we know at this moment, given the enormous disruption in the world by the election of Donald Trump, that might change because of the kind of meandering and often menacing proclamations that are coming from our dear new president. I would argue, and I'm going to spend a little time about this by introduction before I actually get into the issue of financial flows, they're clearly self-destructive. And there's no doubt that what he is doing will undermine the degree of domination of the United States in the areas of science and technology, education, value chain production, international trade, aid, and finance, which will strengthen multipolarity. But I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the Trump regime. I can't, though, entirely ignore it without a few editorial comments at this moment. But basically, and it's important in the context of Africa, Trump really is abandoning what I'd call what we used to be a fairly successful combination for American hegemonic presence in the world, which was a combination of soft and hard power. And he's now moving much more systematically into the realm of coercion. And what we see increasingly, even affecting my university, is these kind of punitive measures of the apparatus of the state, which really includes billions of dollars of curtailment, fiscal expenditures, as well as behavioral related contingencies trying to alter behavior with threats. And what is nothing but pure, often recorded Gestapo-like nabbing and imprisonment of an expulsion of legal and illegal residents, often with a complete suspension of habeas corpus, the absolute abrogation of a list of constitutional rights, including birthright citizenship, the unilateral imposition of tariffs, the threat of overt imperialistic style, military interventions with the potential seizure of sovereign territories. His operational budget, I'm one of the few people that actually downloaded and read this 900-page document, and knew what was coming. So there's actually not a lot that's surprising me because it's quite a bit of his blueprint. I probably killed 2 or 3 trees when I did this, but I can't read 900 pages online. basically. And also he's inspired by somewhat distorted images of fascist dictatorships. I don't want to go into the details of that. I would argue that his strategy of violence and rapid institutional transformation is very much in the spirit of the very famous book by Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine. And so what we have is really a systematic effort at disorientation, dysfunction, the creation of the imbalance of the opposition. And it's really aimed at trying to generate a tabula rasa, which is filled with a new set of authoritarian institutions, or in the Veblennian terms of which Alethia and I very much adhere to in economic theory, habits of thought, commonly generally men and women, aimed at really reconstituting the institutional basis of society, the polity, and the economy. Basically, it's an attempt to kind of set up this new hierarchical structures, both domestically and globally. And much of the oligarchy is already in place in the United States. That's another discussion. But it also is setting in motion, I would argue, what's the end purpose? Well, there are many, but also it's particularly kind of David Harvey style accumulation by dispossession, which is an attempt to actually demonstrate the lack of credibility and the lack of functionality of the state, aimed at then saying, look, the public sector doesn't work, let's hire it over to the private sector. And there's been discussions of privatizing huge trillions of dollars of Social Security into the stock market. Now, whether Trump and his minions will be successful is uncertain. What is certain is that what he has done on multiple planes will have a big impact on polarity in the world. It will generate multipolarity. Now, what about Africa? I'm here to talk about Africa. Okay. There's little doubt that the imposition of this rather insane set of 10 to 50% tariffs on African countries, the end of AGOA really is undercutting the soft power influence of the United States in Africa, and will push Africa towards increasing relationships economically and otherwise with other regions, helping to speed up multipolarity. We look at the area of tariffs. So we can see poor Lesotho, one of the poorest countries in the world, a 50% tariff on their exports, all the way through South Africa, 30%, of tariffs, basically. You can see that Lesotho relies significantly on exports to the United States. It will have a huge impact on the economy. Now, I can, as an economist, not spend a little time looking at the basis of how they came up with this stuff. Now, Trump basically claimed that tariffs are a reaction to the tariffs on the protection of these other countries. It's a complete fabrication. Like, there are tens of thousands of things that come out of his mouth. Basically, the formula simply is used as a trade deficit divided by imports to the United States times 0.5. Where does it come from? It basically comes from the trade balance to zero, the change arising from a change of tariffs, basically, is simply a product of the trade deficit, divided by the elasticity of import prices with respect to tariffs, phi, which is assumed to be 0.25, and the price elasticity of import demand, which is set epsilon at 4. Trump then, they then divide the number by 2, partly because if you read the brief, as I did a couple of days ago, there's a possibility long-term price elasticity imports is maybe 2 rather than 4, in part because they say we're being nice, we're not being so hard. Basically, the numbers are nonsense. The formula is nonsense for so many different reasons, even for mainstream economists, which I'm not. All elasticities vary by country and sector. So the idea that you come up with a single number is completely ludicrous. They assume, actually, in the stated, assume that there's offsetting exchange rate and general effects are small enough to be ignored. That's crazy, basically, because in a world of supply chain and floating exchange rates, you're going to have huge adjustments. That's not even, so it's entirely assumed away. They make a mistake, which I would probably flunk my first-year economics students. I don't teach in economics departments. I did for 20 years, international trade, finance, introductory macro, stuff of that nature, graduate courses in macro. But basically, there's an absolute fundamental mistake. The 0.25 elasticity to import prices is based on assumed retail prices, and it's also nonsense in their discussion, and which in itself is questionable. But they're not looking at retail prices in their formula. They're in fact looking at import price elasticity, which really should be close to 1 by definition. And hence, what they're imposing is twice as high levels of tariffs, otherwise with the assumption of that number, or 4 times higher if you take away their kind division by 0.2. Any undergraduate student knows that if you're trying to look at the impact of trade on the GDP, you need to include services. Guess what? Ignore it. So it's not even included in the gap between exports and imports, basically. You take the South Africa case, which I looked at. South Africa puts a tariff actually of 7.5%. So based on that Rose Garden presentation by their dear president, they should be assessed a tariff of 3.75%. No, so and then if you begin to actually say, okay, if we include the service deficit that South Africa runs with the United States, the tariff rate should be 21%. Now, South Africa basically also, the other part of the fine print is in the South Africa case, they left out tariffs on some key minerals and metals that have to be imported into the United States. So in fact, 40% of the trade with between South Africa and the United States is excluded. And then South Africa says, we're not going to bother retaliating, because what we're going to do is we're going to be punishing our local industries or importing vital elements for the United States. So we're not going to retaliate on the tariffs, right? It's really not worth it. The cost will be much worse than the others. Now, in the days that I used to teach my undergraduate international trade courses, basically, I'd always say, imports and exports are really complicated the way people choose them. And tariffs is a very, very small part of it, basically. So in the case of a poor country like Lesotho, why is Lesotho running a huge goods trade deficit with the United States? It's kind of simple. It's an institutional phenomenon. One is they have AGOA, and they built up a labor-intensive textile manufacturing effort there and exported to the United States. So it came from an institution the United States created. And the second part of why they're not importing from the United States is because they're too poor. They can't really afford much coming from the United States, and as a result, they run a deficit. So and hence they're being punished for being poor, and they're being punished for an institutional arrangement put in place by the United States itself. This is the madness of it. So from the macro perspective, what's going on here? We know that U.S. trade deficit is linked to large government deficits, which really contribute to the U.S. ability to consume more than it's producing. They've been doing it for decades. And it really has to do with the great, as they call it, the great privilege of the dollar, in which you basically can run trade deficits. You can run these deficits for years as long as people are willing to hold on to your currency. It's a privilege of having the hegemonic currency, basically. And so it has permitted the United States to have a higher standard of living than they otherwise would without having this enormous privilege of the dollar. So despite the nonsense that comes from Trump's mouth on tariffs, that it's all going to be in the other country, it's a tax on the consumption of the American population. Nobody can really predict whether it will change the underlying macroeconomics, basically. And I'm an economist for years. I said tariffs can be a very useful industrial tool. It's got to be carefully calculated, try to understand the impact. It should be done for a limited time, and it should be done with other measures in support. Absolutely none of that is embedded in the tariffs that Trump has put in place, basically. And what is certain about these tariffs is that it will lead with retaliation, as China's already done, leading to lower economic growth, greater multipolarity, and as the U.S. diminishes its role in global trade. But I want to now kind of talk about a key area really pertinent to Africa, which is the issue of currencies, finance and financial flows. So why financial flows and what are they? And my classes, I go through a great definition of what they are and everything, but kind of to summarize very rapidly, total official flows incorporate the sum of concessional assistance and non-concessional flows in developing countries, It includes export credits, which have a primarily commercial motive, private flows that are defined as financial flows at market terms, finance out of private resource, including changes in the holding of private long-term assets, held by residents, reporting countries, sovereign bonds, private grants, grants by non-government organizations, net subsidies received by the official sector. Private capital flows liably divided into foreign direct investment, portfolio equity, remittances sent home by migrants, and private sector borrowing. And we'll talk a lot about how those have changed over time and how it's affected African countries. Financial flows really are a key way in which Africa connects to the rest of the world. Though goods and people moving out of the continent, the financial flows really associated with their movements are really important to African economies. We'll talk about. What has been incredibly important in Africa and has shaped the economic structures of African economy, leading to extreme disarticulation since 1980, when a large demobilization of the constraints of those flows. It really opened the African economies through structural adjustment based on some very problematic theory, including open account liberalization, which I'll go over briefly into. I don't have a lot of time to get into the theory behind it. And it opened up the economy, and it pushed the economy even further into disarticulation, where you have this massive, division and divide between what Africa consumes and what Africa produces. And basically, all financial flows are dominated in currencies, and hence understanding the nature of currencies, the institutional power is really central for understanding the comparative global dominance in the world and the subservience that is underneath it. So the key characteristic, as many of you know, of the global financial system, the key architecture is the hierarchy of currencies. And it really helps to define your standing in the global order. Roughly speaking, there's many ways to divide it up. There's a kind of hegemonic currency, the US dollar, major strong currencies, the yen and the euro, minor strong currencies, the renminbi, the Mexican peso. See, I put it up in that category. And then the weak currencies, the Argentinian peso, and then the junk currencies like many African currencies. So understanding the power configurations that are really embedded in this financial architecture is really key to understanding what we have now in Africa, which is another major debt crisis. And as the work of Zajon recently, an article put it, and others have written about this for a long time, debt really is a social relationship marked by asymmetrical material and power differentials between debtors and lenders. As he argues, political attempts to organize some kind of united front against debt, basically with the agenda of trying to understand capitalist development as policies, lacking concern basically for the ontology of debt and its relational consequence within global capitalism, reinforces the discursive normalization of the egregious way in which Africa is integrated into the global financial system. And to really understand that history and that dynamic and that embeddedness, one really has to understand how it interfaces with the global financial system. So money, as we know, is an institutional construct. It has four functions: the store of value, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a standard of deferred payment. The United States is really at the top of this hierarchy, due largely to its capacity to fulfill those four functions. But it should be absolutely emphasized that there's nothing natural about this. It was a deliberate political effort. Some mainstream economists might argue, well, the US deserves this in this rule, but it really was a deliberate effort by the United States, which used its power after World War II to institutionalize the hegemonic position of the US dollar through the Bretton Woods system, really aimed at buttressing its movement towards unipolarity. It provides enormous advantage. Even Trump knows this, right? Even though he's undermining the currency in some ways, his famous comment, quoted by many now, kind of sums it up. We require a commitment from those countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs. well, some countries are already approaching that, right? And should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. Well, Polly has, I think, one of the better articles on understanding the history of how this came about. The dollar hegemony under the Bretton Woods era from 1946 to 71, dollar distress from 71 to 80, and really what was the new era of the building, largely with neoliberal policies, the enormous reinvention, regeneration of the hegemony of the US dollar after 1980, which really was generating by these neoliberal policies and increasing the power of finance capital. We know, and I can't spend a lot of time on this, that dollar hegemony was built into the design, from the beginning of Bretton Woods. The very famous. I've read a lot of these papers at the Bretton Woods meetings of the minutes and everything. Heavily pushed back by Keynes, who understood the enormous problematic nature of actually then creating a dollar-based global economy. The U.S. took full advantage of the system. They didn't play by the rules that they set. I don't know if your previous previous checker, he took his girlfriend to look at Fort Knox. Well, Fort Knox was the basis of the Bretton Woods system, right? Basically, what happened was, the U.S. had agreed to basically not put more money out in the world unless they had enough in the reserve with $35 an ounce of gold, basically. And what it did is, the U.S. used the advantage, as Keynes so predicted, that expanded U.S. global corporations financed huge overseas military operations and really flooded the world with dollars. So that by the 1950s, where you had a ratio of $4 outstanding for every dollar, $4 of gold at $35 an ounce for every outstanding dollar, it had reversed by the early 1970s of 1 to 4. And that's when de Gaulle said, I'm sitting all this dollars, give me gold. And Nixon said, go to hell, you're not getting our gold. And that was the end of the convertibility to gold. It was a period of enormous distress. Bergsten, 1987, neoclassical economists argued it was the end of the dollar hegemony because of the massive deficits. But it really was a tectonic shift, in the rebuilding of the hegemony of the U.S. dollar over this period of time. And it was an attempt to kind of reconstruction. Following the revoking convertibility, foreign banks purchased T-bills instead of gold, which was effectively financed the U.S. deficit, including the U.S. military ventures. The U.S. basically then began issuing debt in its own currency, and you can't default. I mean, basically, if you think about it, you could have an unwillingness to hold U.S. bonds, which could lead to higher interest rate. You could have a currency depreciation, but really neither threatened the hegemony of the dollar once it was locked in. In 1974, the U.S. kind of had a military for dollar agreement with the House of Saudi, which Saudi said all transactions in oil are now in gold, in dollars. In return, we're going to maintain our power in Saudi Arabia. Petrodollars then were deposited and became the U.S. the basis for the lending in Latin America and the crisis in Latin America, which you all know about with the debt crisis. And it really expanded the U.S. dollar as a debt server, debt device, and a standard of deferred payment. In addition, there was the demobilization of the constraints of holding dollars in Europe, which then and the abolishing of exchange controls by Thatcher, allowing people then to begin in Europe overseas to accumulate dollars. The high interest of the Volcker period also encouraged low inflation, a strong dollar at the expense of employment and labor unions. And following that, U.S. basically then began its transformation with a low economy, low taxation rate, deregulation, anti-labor policies, attracting capital and providing motivation for even bringing more dollars into the world, continuing a strong dollar approach. And it really became the center of global capitalism, the center of global financing, and the holding of dollars. Neoliberal policies shifted income from labor to capital while favoring finance. And monetary policy encouraged asset inflation, drawing finance capital into the country. Neoliberalism increased global trade, opened up countries to FDI and other financial flows, generated global production networks and moved manufacturing offshore, putting further pressure on wages and wage share. So rising global health then helped to kind of feed this dynamics of financialization and the hegemony of the US dollar, and what is the extraordinary growth and concentration of wealth in dollars in the world, as we've watched, as we have now increasingly good data documenting the degree of concentration of wealth. And multiple authors have shown the continued domination of the dollar. Basically, a lot of calls that dollar hegemony is disappearing. Even look at the latest data, it hasn't really changed very much. But US dollar share of reserves, cross-border banking claims, banking liabilities, currency debt, issue relative US share of GDP all grew and were higher as high as 2.6, 2.75 from 2015 onwards. The average share of exports between 1999 and 2019 was 96.3%, 74% Asia and Africa, 79.1% in the rest of the world. And so, in essence, total international trade is well over 50% in dollars if we look at export and import still. Only European transactions fell below that. So why does any of this matter? It explains really the evolution of the dollar hegemony, but the question also is we have to understand how that hegemony is played out for those that are at the bottom of the currency hierarchy. And so we have to also talk about hegemony and subordination. The US basically was very much freed from the balance of payments constraint, particularly after the end of Bretton Woods, and hence macroeconomic priorities were generally not impeded by any external consequences. There was massive seigniorage created because of the ability to virtually create dollars for free, and the holding of these trillions of dollars which were costless to produce, as I said. The high demand for US assets then also lowered interest rates and dramatically increased US wealth. In the opposite direction, basically, the Accord with Saudi Arabia committed the price of oil, as did many other commodities, into US dollars. But it's also important to go beyond the hegemonic side to look at the subordination side. This is where we can begin to talk about the African position. We know that the issue of power, even in finance, is interlinked with other dimensions of power, economic, political, and military. And the exercise of state power is really paramount, as is at the core of the system. Currency then, which is state issued, really gives you your standing in the international financial system. Power, though, is relative. The rise in power of one leads to an increase in dollar hegemony, diminishes the power and the rest of the world, exacerbating subordination. Economic power basically is also key to determining which countries will be hegemonic. The size of the country is important, but other really important dimensions are central, technological advantage, productivity, and that in itself is not enough to understand the position of the United States. We also have to have the political will to take on the role of the hegemonic currency, basically, which was largely absent in the war period by the United States, as many authors have pointed out. That changed after World War II with the decline of the sterling and the British Empire, and the US eager to extend its corporate power globally. Two other strategic elements I can't get into much time was the military dominance and the rise of its international political power. The US was the leader of the neoliberal order, the liberal order. You can see that in the way institutions from the World Bank, the IMF, and even the GATT and then the WTO, which were incredibly dominated by the United States and often written to the rules in line with the priorities of the United States. US MNCs basically began to dominate after World War II, played a key role in both accessing US government as an avenue of US government access to overseas countries. All these elements begin to interact, as I suggested. But the key to justify the hegemonic position of the US is these organizations, like the WTO, did the incredibly important thing with the Accord in 1995, of expanding the WTO intellectual property rights, giving the United States 20 years of protection in property rights, which was huge in terms of its imposition of the world. So power dynamics underlying the strengthening of military, economic, political position of the US weakens those that are at the very bottom. The flip side of subordination is also domination, inferiority, and subjugation. The impact basically of the neoliberal policies dramatically changed the nature of the structures of African economies, becoming increasingly more commodity dependent. And it led to a kind of a cycle of boom and bust in these economies, and with it associated debt crisis. Every time delivering these countries into the arms of the International Monetary Fund, which was there to actually then and sometimes maintain the hegemony of the United States and the global hierarchy of currencies. We look very briefly at the IMF. The IMF has always had built in from the beginning, the US was given veto power with a share above 15% from the beginning, and always above 15% because no major changes in the IMF can occur without at least 85% of the vote. And so that has kept that position of directing the power of the IMF. The fund basically, I don't want to spend a lot of time going through this, I'm kind of running out of time. It was a quota system initially. You were allowed to take up 25% per annum of your currency deposits, up to 125% of lending. The only thing that was there in the beginning were graduate charges. They started using conditionality, but conditionality really became widespread when the IMF's credit facilities expanded with standby agreements in 1952. And gradually what happened then is the resources and the size and the impact of the IMF began to expand. With the end of the Bretton Woods period, the IMF became kind of the lender of last resort, largely for poor countries with a huge impact on Africa. From the beginning, they used the kind of anti-inflationary policies, their stabilization analysis, formalized by Pollack in the so-called financial programming model, typically 12 to 18 months, 3.5, 5 years. Credit was allocated in tranches, basically. And they used a kind of focus, a kind of monetarist type approach, maintaining fixed exchange rate by adjusting the domestic absorption capacity to deal with balance of payments crisis, invariably focusing on reducing domestic absorption by cutting back on government spending. And what you had then as a period of time was a huge expansion in the post-Cold War period in which the US military triumphed, and the competition, which created policy space when you had the Cold War, disappeared. And it dramatically reduced the policy space of African countries, forcing them to accept what was then the institutionalization of neoliberal conditionality into the IMF and the World Bank. It strengthened the dollar hegemony, weakened African economies, and created this dependence on commodity exports. And what ended up happening, of course, was that every time the commodities went south, Africa was into a debt crisis and was forced then to get loans from the International Monetary Fund, which invariably is still stuck on this absurd world of pro-cyclical policies, both fiscal and monetary levels. So in essence, you go to the IMF, you're always worse off economically, even in the economic research of the IMF. So poor countries go to great lengths in Africa to avoid the International Monetary Fund. One of the things is building up very large international reserves, which could hypothetically be used to transform economies, but it sits in accounts. I remember having a huge shouting match with the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria saying, during the U.S. war, in Iraq, and I said, why they're sitting on tens of billions of dollars reserves buying U.S. Treasury bills? Said, why are you financing U.S. war in the Middle East? And we had this big spitting match. They had guards there. I thought they were going to shoot me, but at a meeting in Addison, and he just said, oh well, we can't bring it back. He has this very neoliberal notion. It's going to be inflationary, blah blah blah, and they bought into the IMF system. So it creates what I call a vicious cycle of commodity dependence. Because being dependent on commodity creates the conditions that keep you dependent on commodities, because you can't really use that when you have that opportunities. And it electively drives African countries back into the IMF and tends to reproduce the financial subordination. Basically, at the same time, holding reserves actually then empowers the United States when it's held in dollars. And not really much has changed over this period of time. And so the system of subordination feeds into the system of hegemony. What happens is this gross financial system, the system basically reduces policy space, constraints constraints sovereignty, shapes social, political, economic structures of African economies. And so what we've seen is now, once again, the commodity prices peaking around 2015 in Africa. They're going south. At the same time, Africa gets hit with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukrainian war, and inevitably pushes Africa back into another debt crisis. I don't want to go through a lot of it. I have the data here if I had time. I'd go through the history of lending. I kind of follow this stuff basically. But what you had, just to summarize, was these two slides, is you went from only 12 loans for the IMF in 2014 all the way through with these no financial devices. What you ended up having was something in the area of 37 countries getting loans from the IMF from Africa. So it put African countries back in to the hands of the IMF and the neoliberal conditionality, basically enhancing this structural disarticulation. So we can look at the history of, I have probably about 15 more minutes, right, or so? Okay. So we'll look at the history of what has happened. And I gathered data to see where the financial flows are and the degree of policy space within that financial flows. So you look at the period of 1990, I look at the ratio of, basically FDI and remittances relative to ODA, right? Overseas Development Aid. The Overseas Development Aid, as I've written extensively on the history of structural adjustment, both bilateral and multilateral aid worked together in a cartel that ensured Africa was forced to take these structural adjustment neoliberal policies. And so if you look at the ratio of remittances and FDI relative to overseas development aid in 1990, it was 0.11. These countries, if you wanted to get access to vital imports in a crisis, you had to go to official aid. And with official aid, the only thing you could accept was neoliberal conditionality. You had no choice. I remember way back in my in the 1980s when I spent 2 years in Tanzania teaching in the 80s. I remember looking at the IMF conditionality standby agreements in Mozambique and Tanzania. They were virtually the same, and all of them had the same conditionality. There was a big move I wrote a book on Tanzania and IMF. Tanzania was one of the last holdouts, and it was incredibly important to demonstrate to Africa you have no choice. And so they eventually broke Tanzania. They had to then join with the International Monetary Fund and assign an agreement basically in 1986. And so you can see, though, you have more flexibility, and you see the huge growth in part because of the crisis in African countries, massive outflow of people. Some people would say, oh, it's a celebration. Look at all these Africans sending money back to Africa. No. It's incredibly depressing. It's a moment of crisis because you can't survive in Africa. You go off and you increase, and you have this huge role of huge growth of remittances. So you can see going from a ratio of 0.11, African countries increasingly rely on remittances of FDI. It gives them some more policy space. And the numbers, peaking around 2015 at roughly 2 to 1. So what happens over this period is enormous marginalization of official aid. And you can see some changes. I wrote a paper on how African countries, as a result, was able to actually have fiscal expansion during the 2008 crisis because they didn't have to rely on the IMF pro-cyclical policies. And so they actually had anti-cyclical policies during that period of time, which allowed higher levels of growth until we had the collapse in 2015 of international commodity prices. And so you can see it provided a lot of flexibility, both remittances and with FDI. But the problem with FDI, yes, it does provide income coming in, but it has a very problematic structural impact on African countries. What you have basically is huge growth. FDI is always very small in Africa relative to developing countries. So often in the range of 2.5 to roughly 7%. It shrunk as the world moved away from resources, became more information technology intensive. At the time that that World Bank is saying to Africa, oh, you don't really need a higher education. Your comparative advantage. I read and wrote about this. It was insanity that they told Africa you don't really need much education. They cut back the universities. And so when information technology were the basis of the global expansion in the 90s, Africa wasn't participating. You had a huge crisis in the universities, which was deliberately put in African countries. And it meant higher and higher reliance as you cut back on spending on social services, on infrastructure, on education. It led to higher and higher erosion of your capacity to attract FDI in anything other than resource expansion. So you had the huge law of growth and removement particularly after the crisis coming from the Iraqi war, a huge increase in African oil as they began to diversify the number of the sources of oil into Africa away from the Middle East. And so the huge expansion, much of it in FDI, was to countries which were oil producing. By 2000, 2008, more than 60% of the increase of FDI, which went from 2.5 to 7% of developing country FDI, was basically in the two countries, big oil producers, Angola and Nigeria. You had more producers coming online over that period, partly with FDI and gas and oil. So in these oil producing countries, by 2016, 70% of all the FDI in sub-Saharan Africa going to oil producing countries, basically. So it kind of enhanced the resource side of Africa and have to enhance that disarticulation where Africa is increasingly producing raw materials and producing oil and gas, as opposed to actually diversifying the economy. The other element, which I can very briefly go into, is sovereign debt, which became available in 2006, in part because of the huge rise in interest rates. It led to, of course, the junk bond mortgage crisis in the United States. But you also had a situation where all of a sudden the HIPAA countries could get access to sovereign debt. I don't want to go through it in a great amount of detail. The interest rates were ridiculous high. There was during the COVID, the beginning of the debt crisis, when Zambia defaulted on sovereign debt in 2020. The Africa had very little presence, but by 2024, they were starting getting access, but at ridiculous high interest rates. Kenya floated a sovereign debt issue at 10.375%. I mean, that's usurious if you think about these interest rates, basically. And so all very high interest rates during this period of time. And so Africa then paid huge amounts on very high interest rates, incredibly pricey, helping to contribute to the current debt crisis. And you can see just the very high interest rate levels over time that Africa was paying. And then we did a econometric study and said, okay, is it justified? I did with Michael Olabisi. I don't want to talk about it, but basically we showed it was not justified. You cannot use the fundamentals that they say markets are determined by to explain how Africa is paying its interest rates. In our first study, 2006, 2014, we saw roughly 2.9 percentage points overpayment, which could not be explained, which leading to billions and billions of dollars. We recently published an article a couple of months ago looking at the data all the way through 2022, and also saw something like $5 billion of overpayment, which could not be covered. So why do Africans agree to do this? Because it provides dollars without neoliberal conditionality. There's the fungibility of that, basically. But it ultimately leads to this financial vulnerability at a very high rate, and the debt crisis, once again pushing the African countries into the arms of the International Monetary Fund. So I have a few more minutes to talk about it. So this just gives you the enormous structure of African economies. You can see primary commodity overwhelmingly from 87 through something like 90% of 92% of exports. This is ridiculous. This is back to colonial times when you had this structure. The complete deindustrialization economy. I can say I predicted this in an article in 1992 that adjustment would deindustrialize, and it did. And you can see the huge rise of exports of fuels over this period of time, hitting all the way up to 71% in 2008. And a lot of it is driven by the prices. Manufacturing goods really falling most years well below 10%. And you can look at Southeast Asia. It's the flip side. 10, 12, 13% in commodities, and overwhelming in manufacturing goods. We could get into it, but it makes a huge difference in the standard of living. African countries had roughly had a higher real per capita income in dollars in 1970 than Southeast Asia. And by 2020, it was a ratio of 4 to 1. So what you do has huge consequences. The idea of static comparative advantage of this nonsense that they teach in economics, that you should produce what you can produce comparatively, is absurd. As I used to say, any 5-year-old knows you earn a lot more money, basically being a really lousy lawyer than you do being the best shoe shine boy or girl in the world. What you're in and the business you're in has huge consequences to your standard of living. And this just gives us data on UNCTAD on the huge price shock. So let me try to conclude. I have a few more minutes just to try to conclude and open up the questions. So sub-Saharan Africa is once again in a debt crisis. Debt to exports exceeded more than 200% in 2020, numbers we have not seen for 20 years, since before the HIPC and Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, between 1996 and 2005. We now have something like 20 countries that are either in debt sustainability, either in distress or very high risk for debt distress. This gives us kind of the breakdown of where the sources are coming from. And you can see that that it's multiple sources. You've got, a huge growth of what is actually, of course, the sovereign bond debt issue, bilateral debt across the board. And basically what you have here is, so the private debt, the light green, is the huge growth in the sovereign debt and other forms of private capital. And then growth in other cases, slow growth in comparative bilateral growth in aid, and of course, large expansion more recently in multilateral aid. And so both Ghana and Zambia defaulted. We've written a paper just showing the nonsense of the argument I'm one of these crazy self-destructive people that reads IMF reports cover to cover, and it's just, they're still in this world that it's all the cause of African countries. We wrote an article and recently an op-ed on this in the case of Zambia. In Ghana's case, they seem to have largely done everything that orthodoxy told them to do. At one point, the World Bank said, Ghana, the rising growth star and beacon of hope in West Africa. Well, then Ghana defaulted, got into a major debt crisis. And really, it's symptomatic of the deeper malaise of the core of the international financial architecture of the 21st century, basically. And obviously, there's a great need to move away from dollar hegemony towards a much greater financial multipolarity world, which is an enormous challenge. One of the few papers that actually goes in, one of my favorite economists, the institutional economist, Kaltenbrunner, goes out and does this crazy things and actually goes interviews central bankers and people working in financial markets and say, how are these things operating? And one of the problems, and there was this whole movement towards full capital account liberalization, based on this nonsensical neoclassical theory that countries are poor, they have a lower, they have basically, Africa and others have, based on your endowments, your comparative prices of capital are high, prices of labor are low. And so it should attract capital from those where there's a low return in capital developed countries into the developing countries. And that means you should open up your accounts, let the capital come, because you'll have the gain, they'll get a higher return, and it'll lead to higher capitalization. The biggest problem was that Africa, the movement was the opposite direction from Africa. And so then you had this whole Lucas paradox nonsense in the literature. I've written on this, trying to explain it in neoclassical economics, but it's really been incredibly problematic. It's led, as I've shown, in the case of Zambia and Ghana, the openness of the capital account, the ability to buy bonds locally by foreigners helped to contribute to the outflow, the collapse of the currency and the debt crisis, where they could no longer service the debt. In Uganda, the three international banks control 90% of the foreign exchange market. There's very little liquidity in foreign exchange markets, enormous amounts of power. Bankers don't use the currency for economic reasons. They use it simply for defense purposes, heavily aimed at accumulating foreign exchange, basically, and putting it into reserves. There was always a tendency when they interviewed these bankers, they're all very, and I've written on this, incredibly neoclassical in their view, very neoliberal in their view, pushing greater trade and financial liberalization on understanding the impact that it has. constant attempts to accumulate hard currency, and no evidence that they were thinking outside the box, such as drawing on the kind of economic theory that Alethia and I use, institutional economic theory. But there is some hope. And let me talk a bit about, in closing, the next couple of minutes, some of the new attempts. So the ability to break out of the system really requires an alternative set of economic constructs that understands the source of power that perpetuates the system and identifies the power that can be contested. Along these lines, I recommend the work of Eileen Grable, who draws on the idea of the great institutional economist Albert Hirschman about productive incoherence. So embedded in the increasingly messy world of South-South monetary and financial relations, we have institutional innovations that appear incoherent but do provide scope for institutional experimentation. And it leads to what Hirschman called possibilism, increasing the number of ways in which can be visualized and emulated with new institutional experimentation and growing, increasing linkages between institutions. She provides some examples worldwide, but then notes that neither the Asia nor the global crisis had any major catalytic effect on reserves pooling and project financial institutions on the African continent. Others have used this framework to understand experimentation. I won't spend a lot of time on this. I recommend looking at the Fritz and all article on the experimentations with the payment system of local currency, Sistema de Repagos de Moneda, between Mercosur countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. It had minimal impact, but it was an attempt to actually then in these central banks process transactions for small players in foreign currencies, all being settled in basically hard currencies rapidly at the end of the day. It had a moderate effect, but it's been mostly through experimentation. There's also some new transactions being done basically under multiple countries such as Saudi Arabia, Russia, etc. So there's some experimentation going on now within the BRICS system on transactions electronically through central banks. But I want to close with a little bit of a discussion of a new system that's just popped up in Africa, basically. So one step to direction is the creation now of PAPs by the African Export Bank, which is the most progressive of the multilateral banks on the continent. It was a pilot phase 2022. 15 central banks now have signed on with 150 commercial banks to a system aimed at operationalizing it by the end of 2025 this year. It's based on a system of instant payments, pre-funding, and net settlements. Originator purchasing an item in another country issues payment instructions to the bank in their home country, which is sent to PAPS, which checks it out and forwards it to the receiving bank, who clears the funds, the recipient. It requires pre-funding, which is problematic and and challenging, particularly for poor participants. And it needs you need settlement accounts with a real-time gross settlement system with central banks, which then act as intermediaries with those settlement accounts. For those without settlement accounts, they can also use those with settlement accounts. The idea is 24-hour transactions and settling of net positions, and then PAPS then goes to the Export-Import Bank, which has accounts of all the African countries in hard currency, and then does any netting out with hard currency exchanges. So it does speed up trade. It does potentially cut down on transaction costs. It does lead to a potential reduction in the use of the hard currency in the US dollar, which is probably the biggest threat to the hegemony of the dollar now. But the biggest problem in Africa is the structural nature of production. You can't look at spheres independently. If you actually look at the data, only 16% of total trade in Africa is between other African countries. So one has to, when thinking about multipolarity, one needs to be conceptualized beyond a sphere by sphere focus to think about the interaction between the spheres. And basically, one needs, in my opinion, and I've written about, one needs kind of thinking about a continent-wide institution that began to put in industrial policy, encouraging value chain manufacturing within Africa and expanding it eventually to the global South. Along these lines, Malcolm Alabisi and myself, a Nigerian-based economist at Michigan State, have written a paper proposing the creation of an African green bank which would facilitate the generation of green energy and manufacturing supply chain on the continent. At least I heard this paper at the economic meetings in January. Now, perhaps the Trump's tariffs, just in closing, will be a wake-up call and begin to generate the challenging of these hegemonic forces of the status quo, and perhaps begin to move to a multipolar system that can focus on and expand what is the common existential challenge that we face. This is a moment, it's a moment of crisis, a moment of transformation. And like every good moment, we need to crisis, we need to use it for productive purposes. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Howard, for your very insightful presentation. I have a lot of questions. I'm only going to ask you one, because I want to give also the opportunity to the public and to people who are following us in the social media. I was thinking, like 2 months ago, we held a colloquium here about the financial problematic, global problematics, and the role of global South societies in this context. And I think after hearing you that the Trump administration, what is provoking is an exacerbation of this financial situation in regions like Africa or Latin America. And when I was following your presentation, like you clearly highlighted the 70s, when the dollar was being hegemony was being questioned, and how this started with all the structural adjustment programs everywhere. No, I think what is has been under assault all these years since the 70s is the idea of the welfare state in all the world. But in Western Europe and the US, the welfare state was set up, and there was a lot of benefits and rights for American and European population. But the state in Africa or the state in Latin America has never had the capacity to adapt to these structural adjustment measures. I would like to ask you, why do you think that still the impact? I think the impact here in Latin America has been less bad. I don't know how you say that. Less destroying than in Africa. What are the factors that you think that here in Latin America the structural adjustment reforms haven't had this impact, this negative impact? They have had negative impact, but not as much as in Africa. And also, you during your presentation, you presented financial flows as the way, this continent, these societies are linked to the world. And I would like to ask you, I know that maybe the answer is going to be a highly utopian, idealistic answer, but how can we reverse this situation? How can we assess, or how can supply chains, value chains can be reversed in order to bring much value to the resource extreme of the chain? Because we know that African continent is rich in strategic minerals and resources, and that's the primary source of their economy. You proved that they have no industrial capacity, not manufacturing capacity. So is there a way maybe we can reverse the way we envision supply chains, value chains? I don't know if it's possible. Another comment on your presentation, I think that this dependency context of African societies is not traceable to the 70s or even to the colonial period. I think that this structure of dependency goes back to the slave trade with this triangular model, when the basis for dependency were set up, and I think that hasn't changed a lot since those centuries. So I don't know really which is the way out for Africa in this hegemony of financial economy controlled by the US. And basically, that's my question. How can you go out of this vicious cycle that we have talked a lot about of this commodity dependence of African societies, African countries? And also, if you can explain us why during the second decade of the century, when the economist was very hopeful about the growth of African societies, where is this narrative of Africa rising now in this context of the Trump administration coming to power and financial power having ever more power over societies and states of Africa?
I go briefly this so we can open up for other questions. Thanks for your good questions and comments. Basically, African countries had very problematic structures of import substitution that had a lot of trouble weathering structural adjustment. And it led to a situation where they were trying to use and develop industrialization in Africa based on the back of export taxes and earnings on the structures of the economy that were put in place by the colonial regime. You know, I'd argue that I wouldn't call continuity over the pre-colonial period, the colonial period. It was a lot of major transformations. Even if you look at the history of trade in West Africa, there was actually quite a robust handicraft manufacturing industry in Nigeria, you know, in places like Timbuktu and up in the north, in the west coast of Africa, you know, all the way down into Kano. And we have studies which actually shows that they were producing a lot of things, you know, cloths, and they're producing tools, and they were doing a lot of manufacturing, you know, and then it got opened up to the slave trade, and that, you know, had a dramatic impact. It created actually a movement which is often important, which is density of populations. Well, disperse the population because they didn't want to be picked up and thrown off into the Atlantic, you know. So there's no doubt the slave trade had a huge impact on deindustrialization and had a huge impact on the underlying capacities. Part of course, was problematic leadership. You know, Dahomey used to be a center of slave trade. Well, it had a very concentrated economy. It did some agriculture, but mostly it relied on arms and imports over that time, using that for purposes to maintain the political position. It's really a complicated history over this period of time. It wasn't so much continuity of dependency. There was new forms of transformation, but embedded in that was a history of power asymmetries, and it interacted with the rest of the world, which was very problematic, and particularly along the coastal areas. And that power asymmetries really carried on during the colonial period as well, where you really had an opportunity as the global economy became more modern, you know, needed high levels of education. Well, the colonial regimes didn't put anything into that. They didn't put into infrastructure. They didn't put in proper education or health systems. You know, and so Africa then at independence arrived at a huge deficit, everything that was needed. And there was heavy political pressure to rapidly do these things. You know, and you know, you can go from country to country in interventions. You know, the Congo, the assassination of Lumumba, you know, undertaken probably by the Belgians and the CIA. Nobody really knows. I mean, this huge outside disruption which occurred over time. You know, I could spend a long time lecturing on this, but so the bottom line is there was already embedded power symmetries in world relations, which was not as bad in Latin America, which had different histories. It had more and deeper industrialization, which actually could withstand some of these structural adjustment. African countries had very loose, very problematic institutions that were heavily dependent often on technology, which was not embedded but imported, which really, when they came in and they opened up these economies and got rid of protectionism and liberalized everything, it was devastating. When they privatized a lot of these state-controlled industries, and some of them were very viable, they were destroyed. They weren't privatized, they disappeared. So I would argue that the real impact, the full breadth and depth of structural adjustment as impact on Africa was in Africa and other parts of the world. It was hit by the most. They were the least resistant to the ability to transform the economies. It was devastating for the economies. And what I'd also say, which is extremely important, is that if you want to look to transformation, look to Asia. This is where they've used a different set of policies and have avoided the influence of the IMF and the World Bank, the outside institutions, to pave their own way. You can take a look at the case of China. A couple of years ago, I highly recommend Isabel Weber's book on China. And basically, it's how China avoided neoliberal shock therapy. They created, and part of our argument and part of what I've written on is the institutionalization of neoclassical economics. And that was incredibly important because you have the ability to transform economies. But if the minds of these economists are caught in this kind of coloniality of thinking, which is basically neoclassical economics, which comes from the North, you don't come up with alternative ideas. I can't tell you the number of times of vicious fighting matches I've had with African economists, because there was a deliberate attempt, as I've written in a 2021 article in Economy and Society, it was a deliberate attempt to completely transform these economies in terms of the economic thinking from the beginning. And it was done by friends of mine that I used to teach with in Tanzania in the 80s. And they were neoclassical trained economists in the United States that came in through the African Economic Research Consortium to completely change the nature of thinking on the continent. So in the case of China, they never let these neoliberal, neoclassical economists, as they got trained, to have any impact on policy. They were smart enough, and they did their own way with their own thinking. And you look at Korea. Korea's industrialization wasn't run by neoclassical economists; it was run by engineers. It's the same in these other places. And so part of the problem is this, and it really was, and I need to write another paper on it. It was a deliberate attempt by the World Bank and others. Same thing in East Asia, where they handed we have Russia today because of the madness of handing over privatization to oligarchs and creating a structure economically and politically. And now we have the kind of Putin fascism, that comes out of this oligarchic model. And so part of the issue is also we have to have a major transformation of economic thinking, and then towards that, and the final thing I'll say is towards that, I'm working with French-trained economists in Lungosila, and we're working with Ideas to build a new organization called IDEN, Ideas Africa Network. We'll be having a launch conference in the fall, and it really is to try to retrain economists to heterodox economics. Really is being open-minded and saying we need to really open our ideas to, it's kind of like physics saying, the only thing in the world is Newtonian physics. Let's forget about quantum physics. And so it's just a huge narrowing over time of neoclassical economics, which has been so devastating because it's not just utopia. It's actually understanding how history has worked and using history as a mechanism of education and understanding of how to begin to transform these economies. The ability is there. The space is there. I used to hear, well, WTO, they're not going to allow you to do these industrial policy. There's still lots of things you could do. At one point, there wasn't a single African country taken to the WTO court. And I said, why not push it? But the key really is rethinking. And it's not just in the academic of economics departments, and it's worldwide, even here in Mexico, that you need to open your minds. It also runs all the way through this decades of teaching people that are newspaper writers, and people working in Ministry of Trade Department, ministries of trade, people working basically, in the areas of ministries of finance. It's this huge, very pernicious set of theoretical weapons that does not see the possibilities of other things that can be done in the world, right? And that's what we've been pushing back on. On top of everything else, I'm just finishing up a book on something called on institutions and industrial policy in Africa. It's really utilizing a set of tools to understand how you build up the capacities for industrial policy to transform in Africa. I'll shut up there, but thanks for your questions.
Thank you, Howard, once again. And now we have time to pick up some questions from the audience and from the internet as well. So we can start here with the ones that are here present.
Hi, good morning. My name is Cesar Duarte. I'm a researcher here at the Institute. I would like to know your opinion about during the story that you presented us, the IMF is a key actor, right? With all these changes that are happening especially with the US, how do you see the IMF in the near future? Do you see that they are changing the role? Do you see like getting more in line with what the US is doing? I just want to know your opinion. Thank you.
Maybe take one or two other questions and then I'll answer.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. You make a big conference from all the financial system and what will happen since the post-war war. But I would like to say something. First of all, well, all this, well, I will begin. Well, I think today, during days, we are living a very interesting moment, not only of a financial crisis, but a new structural change, a very deep structural change, because all these movements in the stock change market are taking us. I was yesterday trying to see how has been falling that Dow Jones. Comparing with the 2008, the 15th of September 28, even comparing with 5 years ago when the pandemic was whole, and today, and at least it was 30% that the Dow Jones was lowered. Well, in all of this, we have to change what's going. It's not only Trump. Of course, Trump is a little crazy, but we are living. Yes, well, it's we have to see more what's going in the structural of the world economy, and the thing is that we need to take the theory of Schumpeter, because we need a destruction, but a very huge destruction of how we are living right now, to take a new economy, to have also new profits. And in all this what we are seeing in the Wall Street, in the stock exchange and whatever, that where is Africa and where is China? And of course, most of the roots of all this change in Africa is all the colonial period, is all the fracture of the democracy, because they were independent, but at the same time, most of the leaders were imposed by the colony, especially by USA. That's why they killed Lubumba. I remember I was very little when they Lubumba, no? Yes, yes, I remember very well. And the other thing is all these. I think one of these countries, especially in the sub-Saharan, I think they are going to in all these structural change. The alternative right now is China, because that social debt that these countries have is done by the African investment, especially in trains, in ports, in roads, whatever. But the other thing is that we must read very careful Rosa Luxemburgo book, because for me, okay, it's China, but it's another imperialist movement of China, because most of the commodities for this deep structural economic change are in Africa. We need that digital economy. We need, of course, all the, for example, for the climate change, the panels, the 90% of the panels in the world are Chinese, because they are very, very cheap, no? So there's something it's a new movement or new structural change that we are living. And well, I don't know. So that's just a comment. And even it is very interesting. Other thing that I presented in the now in the AFI, all the institutional investors that are in these Chinese companies. And today, I just read early morning that there are 6 Japanese banks that they are not continue in the investment of the for the climate change. This is just terrible because the climate change is true. But with all these Trump ideas to return to the fossils, so I have so many. Sorry, I am very very confused about what we are reading. So I don't know what's your opinion.
Let me just quickly respond, Alicia, to you and the other question. Okay. Okay. Basically, we're meant to be confused, but we need to sit back and think about what's really going on. The IMF is up for grabs. It would be crazy for the United States to blow up the IMF and because it's been so effective for them. But who knows with these people? At this point, I don't think it's going to happen. There has been discussions in Project 225 of maybe withdrawing from the IMF and the World Bank, but we'll see. It's played a very effective role for the United States. Would it change the nature of what the IMF is doing? I'm not sure, because the IMF is totally embedded with neoclassical economics. They really don't know much of anything else. For years, they used to, in Africa, they'd have before they had such a widespread impact of the ARC, they used to bring in Ministry of Finance and central bank people to spend 6 months or a year at the IMF to get conditioned about IMF thinking. It's very much embedded. It hasn't really changed much. It's still really effective. And China really hasn't challenged it. China has increased its percentage representation in IMF, but in some ways, that gets into the Chinese Africa relationships. And I do a lot of reading on it. I do a lot of lecturing on it. I've written a couple of pieces on it. I'll probably do some more at some point. But what happened is China's kind of used the cover of neoliberalism in an effective manner. They joined the WTO. They pretend they're going through these motions. They don't really challenge what the IMF is doing, inside the IMF. It still continues to be very neoliberal and in its conditionality. And it hasn't really changed the nature. The reallocation of SDRs, was done in a manner which had the potential to have a big impact on Africa. But they decided just to give it based upon what your quota already was. And China went along with it, and instead of kind of reallocating it, because the SDRs have a huge potential to move out of dollarization, because it gives you then the ability to be able to access goods and services without having to rely on the dollars, just using your credits, through the SDR. And so they look the other way, and they continue to perpetuate it. They might have done some of the lending of the poor countries, but it was a really wasted opportunity during the crisis to transform what the IMF was doing, because you do have then. Yeah, it was more like of the kind of thinking of Keynes on putting bankers in, having its own credit system in the world rather than relying on the US dollar. And so, but that moment's kind of come and gone. Will it change again? Who knows? Maybe there'd be a potential to push that a bit more if the US leaves. I don't think they're going to tolerate that, because very clearly that Trump will keep pushing dollar hegemony. China-Africa relationship, it's complicated. I kind of put it somewhere in between the middle, as I call it pure imperialism, and those that call it a great moment for development for Africa, because it has led to some positive developments infrastructurally, but it has not changed the nature of the structure of trade. If you actually look at the data, something like not over 90% of exports to from Africa to China is resources. It hasn't changed the nature of the structure. For Africa, it's been largely a way of bringing in a lot of cheap consumer goods, and it hasn't done a lot for manufacturing. They put very little. There was some movement, I've spent some time in Ethiopia, of China saying, maybe this is where we'll set up some manufacturing. But they've actually done a minimal amount of, much of the FDI has been resource focused. some movement now into agriculture of Chinese FDI, but the overwhelming majority of it really has been mines, oil expansion, the kind of things that are already just kind of enhanced the structure of Africa. But it has built, I mean, look at, we do a lot of work on land issues in Tanzania the last 16 years. I worked with two anthropologists and a geographer studying the impact of property right formalization, Hatimiliki, and its impact on the economies. We do a lot of socioeconomic surveys and studies. But, we used to work in the area in Babati, which was in northern Tanzania. Before the Chinese built the road, it would take us 6-7 hours to get there from Arusha flying in. And that now became 2 hours. That's a big difference. There is positive impacts infrastructurally, otherwise it's uneven, that China has provided for Africa. But it's also set an enormous amount, has not really changed the structure of the economies, and has now changed a lot of debt problems. And now we have a real problem with China being part of the common framework of the G20, in which the common framework basically, in which you have their participation for the first time. Before, remember, they always avoid the Paris Club in reorganizing debt. But that's very problematic because there's a fundamental divide between what their view of debt relief is and what the other view is. So they're not willing to take haircuts, and so the common framework has done really little to deal with the debt crisis so far in Africa. It's gone nowhere really, and for the most part, there's I think only 4 countries that participated in it. And then they're playing games. They say, well, really some of our money coming from the Export-Import Bank is private, so it really should be in the private group discussions of the common framework. And others say, no, it's official aid, and it's on the official side in kind of the Paris group, Paris Club. And so it's been difficult, and they're not really willing to adjust it. Their view always is a debt crisis is an issue of cash flow, and hence we need to just change the terms rather than to completely reduce it. And so it's China. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. China was sitting on what, $4 trillion of US dollars. They started recirculating some of that. Belt and Road Initiative was really an attempt to use it for purposes, build the kind of soft power strength of China in the world with some economic benefits. Africa was seen as an important source of resources into their manufacturing process. And that's when they started getting really upping their manufacturing, that's when they really built the relationship with Africa after 2000. And you can look at this data and it all kind of verifies this. And so basically, is China the hope here? It's problematic. Ultimately, I would argue that any change has to come from Africa by Africans. And that's really what we've been trying to build. I try to do all my writing and a lot of my research with Africans for many years, but again, they're hamstrung by the coloniality of their economic thinking. The ability to go beyond that, to understand what is possible. But there are, as I said, finally some progressive movements. I've made some progress, become good friends with the former chief economist, Export-Import Bank. I'm on their Journal of African Trade, on their editorial board. I try to bring more heterodox economic publishing into their mainstream journal, but it is a challenge. But ultimately, I'd argue it can't come from this room; it has to come from within Africa. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have still time for another question. Anybody in the audience?
Any questions from social media at all? Or?
From social media, any questions?
Hi. I'm not an economist undergraduate, so I don't know. So I don't know if this is going to be maybe an obvious question, but as I was listening to your lecture, I was thinking, is it possible to understand the tariffs that Trump is now imposing and the debt crisis that has been developing in Africa for a few years now, as maybe ways in which Africa can be kept as a kind of reservoir of natural goods that can be exported to other countries, keeping a low cost? That's my question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, Professor. I'm just letting you know one question from social media. It's in Spanish from Diana Saavedra. I will try to translate it. It's taking into account the current situation with President Trump. What should the nations of Latin America do? Is it time to get together between Latin America and Africa?
Okay, very quickly, just response to, thanks for the questions. Africa has a lot of resources, and that's what's really been developed over time. But if you were China and your FDI coming in, and let us say that you wanted to let's say exploit their nickel to build batteries for EVs, China would have said, no, you're not getting access to that unless you actually build the batteries here. And that's really what Africa has to do. You have the opportunity for leverage now. African countries, in my view, this is the opportunity to say you don't get access to the resources unless you build the factories here. And then you can get access to the resources. And it was the same thing with FDI in China. They said basically, we'll allow you to do manufacturing here for export. You'll pay higher taxes. But if you bring in co-ownership with the Chinese company, and we'll give you access to the Chinese market at lower tax rates. And it was simply contingent behavior that then forced the FDI in a manner which was much more developmental. But that hasn't happened, partly because of the impact of neoclassical economics. Oh, you can't do that. The states can't make decisions. You can't put these pressures on, which is very, very problematic. We have a moment now, I think, that where South-South economic relations have to be built. This is the opportunity. African countries have to be thinking about, as I said, internal supply chain value-added systems, but also linking to other South-South countries, including Latin America. You have hundreds of millions of people, huge markets, more than 1 billion people in Africa. Here, a massive number of people here in Latin America. And I mean, it's time to build these South-South economic relationships, South-South financial systems. And some of it's been discussed, a lot of it's been rhetorical. Even BRICS talked about an alternative currency, has gone nowhere. BRICS is a bit problematic, having Saudi Arabia and Russia in with it. I mean, this is a bit iffy, that kind of relationships. But I think ultimately you need strength from within to be able to create relationships outside. And this is really which has to be done from both continents, coming together, building up a new institution of relations, new trade agreements, and trying to do what I would argue is continent and ultimately South-related value chain production, that moves away from domination with North and the United States. And I'll probably get arrested at the border for that comment, but when I return. But I'm speaking what I think is ultimately for the welfare of the vast majority of the world's population. Thanks.
Well, I thank you. We thank you a lot, Howard, for your presentation and answering all of our questions. I don't know if we still have time for another question. Yes, we still have another time for another question, maybe. Onyeka, you don't want to? No? Okay. Anybody from social media? So okay, so we can take a break and
okay. Muchas gracias. I know I go on, and thank you for listening to me patiently.
Good morning again. We are going to proceed with panel number 1. So I would like to invite Dr. Bruno and Dr. Betsy to the floor. So this is the panel number 1. It's entitled African Migrations in the Americas. And well, first of all, I would like to thank to the professors that are presenting today. So first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Bruno Miranda, who will present the topic Contemporary Black African Diasporas, Instability and Acceleration in the Americas. He is associate researcher at the Institute of Social Research here at this university, PhD in Political and Social Sciences, member of National System of Researchers of Mexico. He obtained the award for the best PhD thesis in social sciences granted by the Mexican Academy of Science in 2016. He coordinates projects to understand the rearrangement in American migratory systems caused by the transit and settlement of migrants from Asia and Africa and the Caribbean in Mexico. In this sense, he analyzes how Mexico and its border spaces fit into the puzzle of migration governance on a regional and global scale. He teaches in the undergraduate program in anthropology and in the graduate program in political and social sciences. Bruno, be very welcome, and you have the floor.
Yeah. Well, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. Alethia, Jose Luis, Vania, these are people who carry out the program of studies on Asian and African at UNAM. I'm very pleased to be here and to share my work with other colleagues. Very pleased to meet you, Betsy. And I understand Gisele is connected. Yeah, I know her work as well. And with Alethia, we have been working in the past. So yeah, it's a very cozy table. So in this presentation, I will describe the most recent period of African diasporas in the cities and spatial nodes that make up the migratory corridors connecting Brazil and Argentina with Mexico along several South and Central American borders. This presentation is based on 2 research conducted between 2019 and 2023 that included ethnographic fieldwork in Tapachula. You will be hearing about Tapachula along my presentation, and the southern border of Mexico, and Tijuana and Ciudad Juárez. These are in the northern border, as you may know. I will share findings and reflections on the transit and settlement of African migrants, mostly sub-Saharan, mostly Black migrants, whose experiences in Mexico is still partially in the shadows. The central objective is to bring to the table the debate about the reconfigurations in African migratory trajectories that include Global South geographies. For almost 10 years, the migratory corridors connecting South and Central America with Mexico, the US and Canada, and certain border spaces that shape these corridors along the Americas, like the Darien Jungle, have seen a much greater diversity of migrants in terms of origin, nationality, race, religion, and languages. What is new for Mexico is the reproduction of border spaces where migrants all over the Global South of different African origins have been forced by the state to wait for papers to wait for an appointment, an asylum appointment. So they have been forced to wait in Mexican territory. The biennium 2015 and 2016 concentrated different so-called migration crises in the Caribbean. The Cuban crisis in 2015 set off by the closure of Nicaragua's southern border with Costa Rica, and the expansion of the Asian diaspora from South America to Central America and Mexico from 2016 on. Since then, figures from the Panamanian National Border Service and the National Migration Service of Panama and those of National Migration Institute of Mexico show that mobilities of African migrants have remained steady. The year 2015 also marked a phase of European rebordering, characterized by the reconfiguration and militarization of borders, as well as the reinforcement of borders that were externalized. We can talk about border externalization in the debate if you want. The European borders were externalized, reaching toward Turkey, the Maghreb, and the Sahel in Africa. Testimonies gathered by me during fieldwork reflect a shift in migratory routes toward the Americas, from Europe toward the Americas, prompted by the growing challenges of crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Mexico has experienced changes in terms of mobilities from other regions and continents, not limited to Central America. That's very important for my argument. Including many Asian diasporas, such as the Bengali from India and China, and that of African diasporas, such as the Congolese and Senegalese. These groups have different migration patterns, routes, means of transportation, motivations to migrate, and different plans and goals. They have turned Mexican borders into spaces of super diversity, as defined by Steven Vertovec. Along with the aggravation of warlike conflicts like the ones in DRC, motivations include drastic climate events like the drought in the Horn of Africa, political, ethnic, gender, and religious persecution, as well as context of scarcity. Sometimes motivations involve a sharp sense of adventure, mainly among African youth. Next, I present 3 ethnographic accounts documenting the presence and spatial transformation of African migrants in Tapachula on Mexico's southern border and their interactions with other migrant groups. Is this working? Okay, so here we can see in the foreground, this is Tapachula, March 2022. In the foreground, we can see young Africans from West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa waiting for the return of their passports that would be delivered to them with a stamp that would allow them to transit through Mexico. So we can hear in the foreground there are African migrants, and in the background we have Asian and South American migrants. That's what I called super diversity border space. We can talk about that later on. Podemos avanzar. This is not working, right? Yeah, it should work. Okay. Okay, this is Big Dreams African Food in Tapachula, 2024. It is a restaurant managed by a couple from Ghana and Mexico. It is not the first restaurant we have had in Tapachula serving African and eventually Asian migrants in situation of waiting, no? People who were waiting, forced to wait for the documents. Please, once more. This is Tapachula as well. This is an Asian restaurant serving food, serving Dominican food, Cuban, and African food. This is the way these Black migrant groups interact with each other, at least until January 20th, right? We can talk about that later on if you want. No, we can wait. Thank you very much. Waiting periods in Mexico can stretch over months or even years, effectively transforming African migrants into temporary residents of Mexican cities, particularly in border regions, but increasingly in major urban centers like Mexico City. During waiting times, many reconsider their plans and migratory routes, but they also engage in process of social and economic reproduction. Migrants in waiting must secure sources of income, often by entering the informal labor market or relying on remittances, not only from the United States and Canada, but remittances also from initial countries of refuge in South America, and even from their communities of origin. That's something I have seen. Families that send remittances from Senegal, for example, to sustain transit. They require access to healthcare, safe recreational spaces for the children, and basic security. In this sense, Mexico emerges as a provisional site in the geography of recent African migrations and diasporas, a space of temporary settlement for diasporas in motion, eventually headed toward more established diasporic hubs in the global north, such as Quebec, for example, in Canada. Now we can, in Mexico, migrants are often confined in migrant holding centers, called here Mexico estaciones migratorias. This is an euphemism. They are confined in estaciones migratorias while their entry is processed by authorities. The number of African migrants began to rise significantly after 2015, if you can see, peaking in 2019, where we had more than 7,000 migrants, irregularized African migrants, and then again in the post-pandemic period between 2021 and 2024, with a notable surge in 2023, where we had more than 60,000 African migrants in transit and in waiting, right? While in 2019 there were approx 7,000 African migrants, by 2023 the number had escalated to nearly 60,000, as I told you, with particularly high concentrations from countries such as Cameroon, the DRC, and Ghana. Not every African migrant comes directly from Africa. During the last decades, migrants from different regions of Africa have sought refuge in certain South American countries, especially in the Southern Cone. That includes Argentina and Brazil. Given the political and economic crisis, these people, generally young people, have decided to travel to the US and Canada through Mexico in search of a second and sometimes a third refuge. Others have used the legislation on refuge in Brazil, for example, or the possibility of visas in other South American countries as a springboard to the global South. The constant acceleration of the spatial dispersion of African diasporas, particularly sub-Saharan and Black diasporas, include settlements in cities such as Quebec, established hubs of these diasporas: Quebec, Montreal, Portland, Maine, Cincinnati, Dallas, Los Angeles, but also São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, La Plata, and Buenos Aires. In the new geography of African diaspora, some Latin American countries are used as Plan B or as stepping stones toward the US and Canada. During the period between 2001 and 2015, Brazil was by far the Latin American country that received the highest number of asylum applications, accounting for nearly 42,000, 55% of which were from people from Africa. The economic growth experienced by Brazil during the first decade of the 21st century contributed to its appeal, particularly for those with shared racial and cultural identities. However, with the onset of the economic crisis in 2015, again, this is a very important year, and the political instability following President Dilma Rousseff impeachment in 2016, the inability to send remittances back home led many to reconsider their migration or migratory strategies, prompting them to once again embark on routes toward the US and Canada. The acceleration of African diasporas in global South countries also entails in spatial instability. Ruth, a 40-year-old Nigerian woman, spent 6 months waiting in Tapachula, Mexico, during the summer and fall of 2019. She then moved to Querétaro, a city in central Mexico, where her daughter was born. When she finally reached Tijuana and the border with the US, the COVID-19 pandemic had been declared and the Mexico-US border had been closed to non-essential crossings. By mid-2022, Ruth had spent almost 2.5 years moving through different Mexico cities. In the case of fragmented and prolonged mobilities like Ruth's, at what point, I ask you, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, can we truly speak of destination? What are the real possibilities of integration or incorporation to whole societies? According to Martinique's geographer Cédric Audebert, some diasporas are unstable in a constant state of flux. He uses the idea of instability to describe the ongoing mobility and settlement of Asian migrants in Latin America and the Caribbean following the 2010 earthquake. An idea that is, I consider, equally applicable to African diasporas in the age of smartphones and transcontinental air travel during the last decades. Final remarks. Instead of long-lasting settlements, such as those that have characterized African diasporas throughout the 20th century, it seems that the reinforcement of migration policies and borders in the global north, such as Europe and the US, have broken up even the most consolidated diasporas by forcing them to settle temporarily in countries considered Plan B, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. The borders and urban centers of Mexico have become diasporic spaces in the sense that they now accommodate members, or they host members of African diasporas. With the suspension of the access of asylum or the asylum access or the asylum system in the US, nowadays, Mexico has strengthened its position as a country of waiting and refuge. Migrants from the DRC and Angola are already visible in street camps here in Mexico City. Yeah, because there are still there are not enough shelters in Mexico City still. The acceleration and instability of African diasporas in the global South in Latin American cities will likely lead to more prolonged settlements in this new anti-migrant era. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruno, for your presentation. Later in the conversation, I would like to have a better understanding of these super diverse waiting spaces that you mentioned about. I think it's very interesting, especially with the phrase that you finished your presentation, that apparently we are going to an anti-migrant era. So I just wonder if it's globally speaking. I understand that there is a very strong influence from the United States, but I would really like to think that it's only like very localized. Maybe we can discuss this later on. Well, now I would like to introduce Professor Betsy that will present the topic Mexican migrant communities in the US, Afrodescendancy and competing idea of racial formation. Elizabeth Sweet is an Associate Dean in the School for the Environment and Associate Professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Community Development at the University of the Massachusetts, Boston. She's an expert in planning theory and qualitative research methodologies. Professor Sweet engages in collaborative community economic development, focusing on the links between economies, violence, and identities. Using feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial frameworks, her works in the US Native, Black, Latino, and Latin American communities has led to long-term collaboration and inclusive projects that both push the boundaries of planning theory and methods, while at the same time provides practical planning intervention. She has pioneered the use of body map storytelling and community mapping as innovative ways to co-create data and strategies with communities on a wide range of issues and urban problems. Theoretically, these methods create awareness that enables planners and communities to re-envision their relationships with environments and see their visceral, historical, and spiritual bonds. These new understandings promote new practices. Her most recent project is focused on Afro-Mexican and Native erasure in Mexico in the way that anti-Black Native narratives impact Mexican Chicanos in the US cities. She is also working in the Costa Chica in Mexico to document Afro-Mexican traditional ecological knowledge. Betsy, welcome to UNAM. The floor is yours.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much. It's so weird to be here and speaking in English, but here we go. Again, thank you to the whole, I don't know.
Professor Stein and the rest of the group doesn't.
It's okay. I want them. Sorry. So I really appreciate the invitation. It's really great to be here. This is my kind of dream place to be in UNAM. And so again, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be here. And I just wanna, I didn't do a presentation like a PowerPoint because I'm still a little bit indecisive about how I want to proceed. So I'm gonna proceed. And part of my indecision, and I was talking to Bruno a little bit earlier about this, was that racial formation and race in general in Mexico has been a topic that can enrage some people. And I have been the recipient of rage. So I'm gonna sort of play it by ear, and I'm trying to like read the room, and I don't wanna like offend folks. I'm really interested in conversation. I'm interested in dialogue. I'm interested in really thinking about how we can move forward in our thinking on race. Am I okay? Yeah, okay. You're like hand signals. I'm like, what's going on? Okay. So one of the things that I've really been interested in for a long time, I started doing my research here in 1995. So I'm pretty old. And one of the things that wasn't really the topic of my research, but it was something that I noticed, not only in the community that I was looking at issues of how structural adjustment was impacting Indigenous women in the state of Morelos. And this was, right after NAFTA. So NAFTA was 1994. I came in 1995. So everything that we heard from Dr. Stein, I was like, yeah, I got that. I like that. I talk about that. That really fits to what I've experienced here as well. But one thing that kept sort of nagging at me was this idea of what is race? Who is Black? Who is Indigenous? How do we understand racial formation here? And it was very different from what I experienced in the United States. So I think this is part of the rage that I receive, is because I'm seen as this, even though I'm Native American, I'm Abenaki, but I'm seen as a colonizer from the United States, coming here and trying to tell y'all Mexicans what y'all need to do, or how to think about things. And that's the farthest from what I want to do. But when I came and was working in this village, it's called San Andrés de la Cal. I don't know if people know it. It's part of Tepoztlán. It's like coming from Cuernavaca, you go by Santa Catarina, and then there's an entrance into San Andrés. I was particularly interested in Indigenous women there. And when I got to the family that I was living with, and I stayed in that village for 3 years, they told me that they were not indigenous anymore, that they had cut their hair and changed their clothes, and therefore they were not Nahuatl anymore. And for me, that was shocking and strange. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go with that. And that wasn't the focus of my work, but it was part of the peak of my interest in issues on racial formation here in Mexico. And as I was also mentioning to Bruno, there was an exhibit in Chicago, the African Present in Mexico in 2006 in a museum there, the Mexican museum there, Mexican Art Museum. And it really was sort of something transformative in my own experience and thinking about Africanness in Mexico. And it still wasn't the focus of my research, but it was still kind of nagging at me. And my husband, who is quite dark-skinned Mexican, after that exhibit, looked in the mirror and told me that he was indeed African. I said, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. Okay, sorry, I said that. I'm not very professional. But anyways, it was like transformative for him to see that exhibit. And he's from Puebla. He's not from the Costa Chica. He's not from Veracruz. He's from Puebla, right in the middle of the country, south middle of the country. And if you go to the village where he was born, it's a very tiny, tiny village near Chautla. It's called San Martín de la Flor. Almost everyone there looks like him, right? So it's not like this is an anomaly, like he's like the only African dude there. And so for me, the idea of understanding what is race, how is race formed here, how do people understand race, is really something that I find extremely interesting, although a little terrifying, because I know that here it's a little bit of a taboo. Like I said, I have been on the receiving end of some not so nice comments. But what I wanted to sort of do a couple of things here. That was sort of an introduction. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of mestizo and how that functions here. And then also how that the racial formation, and I'm generalizing, and I know we should never generalize, but I'm going to generalize a little bit about how sort of this racial formation based in mestizo, mixed race people, how that travels to the United States, and how there's almost like a shock, a choque, an accident. So meeting the sort of racial formation that is pretty dominant here around being mestizo. It's changing, obviously, but and the one drop rule that we have in the United States, that's a little bit more flexible now than it had been in the past, but it's still pretty dominant. Like you can be very light skinned, but if you have Black relatives, you are Black there. And that is not the case here, right? And so you have folks going to, for, 100 years or more, right? And the experiences that Mexicans have in the United States are very closely related to experiences that Black African Americans have in the United States. So there's a whole lot of lynchings of Mexicans in the United States, right? There's a lot of similar kinds of Mexicans need not apply, Mexican water fountain over here. So there's very similar kinds of experiences of Black and African descended people in the United States that Mexicans are experiencing, and it's confusing and it's terrifying, I think, at some level too. And so that's kind of the second part of what I want to talk a little bit more about, the details of how this traveling phenomenon of mestizo racial formation impacts folks who are migrating, whether they're whatever color, whatever flavor of Mexican folks are, they're still sort of put in this group of not white. So let me just talk a little bit about mestizoism. And you guys got to keep me on task here. Do I have like 10 minutes more? Okay. So I'll try 5 and 5. So mestizoism, I think most people here understand it as the idea that we are the cosmic race, right? That mestizoism is this combination of whites from Europe, of indigenous people, of African folks who were kidnapped and brought here through the slave trade, right? And so we have this mix of these folks. I don't know when it was, you guys can tell me, 16, whatever, when there was equal parts, right? Third, a third, a third. And so out of that emerged this idea that we are, as mestizos, and I'm putting me in there just because I'm in Mexico right now, but that we are this superior race, that we are not white, we are not indigenous, we are not Black, we are a mix and we are superior. And I think that was a very important and needed, maybe even, theory, way of thinking about how things were, because the United States is so dominant and such jerks when they're, you know, at the border, attacking, stealing half the land. Like, you know, there was a need to sort of pump us up down here, right? That we are a superior race, we are a cosmic race. But what I think has happened, and this is, you know, y'all can debate me on this, I'm happy to be in dialogue, is that what maybe originally started out as this idea of equity and race as this group of everybody together, which makes us stronger, started moving toward whiteness. So that the idea of mestizo was, yes, it was there, and for a long time, and you guys can correct me also, on the census, you really couldn't, I mean, now you can, but you couldn't put Afro-Mexican. You had to pick mestizo or you had to pick indigenous, right? Those were the two races. And I remember in 2005 at Cream with Brigida Garcia, who was a demographer, I assume she is retired since now, that she was talking about all kinds of statistics on the census. And I asked her, and we had a Rockefeller Fellowship thing, and there was a bunch of people there. And so she was making her presentation. And I asked her if she felt like those two designations were sufficient to document what is really actually happening in terms of race in Mexico. And she said no. And then it was like, attack the person who talked about race, because we don't really talk about race, and we don't want it to be associated with the way race is in the United States. And I even had a couple of graduate students afterward. They had these really sandwiches. I won't say how good they were, but there was some sandwiches afterwards, a little reception, and two very dark-skinned PhD students came up to me and said, we can't talk about this. Don't talk about race here, because if we talk about race, then that's gonna demonstrate that there is a difference and that we are inferior if we talk about it. And so I think the idea of mestizo is covering up. I like Catherine McKittrick. I don't know if you know her. She's a Canadian geographer. I don't remember where she is now, somewhere in Toronto. But anyways, she talks about the unning of things. So she talks about ungeographic. She talks about things that are not invisible, but unvisible, because it's not a case that something is just invisible because it's invisible. It's that it has been made to be invisible. So she talks about unvisibility. And so for me, that seems to me what has happened in Mexico, that there's been this attempt, and I can give you lots of examples of how this, I see it in every day, the quotidian life of Mexicans, of covering up Blackness. Like it doesn't exist. And then people don't wanna, there's no pride in being Black. There's no way of being proud of Blackness. And it's something you don't wanna be, but you wanna be white. So if you go to the store and you can be dark skin, and they're gonna say, ¿Qué quieres, güerito? ¿Qué te vendo, güerito? Right? Like, what can I sell you, white man or white woman? I mean, and you can be really dark, but it's a way of sort of lifting them up so that maybe they'll buy from you because you're making them feel good because they're white. And so that's part of how I think about we are moving toward whiteness through this idea of mestizoism. Other examples are when a baby is born and somebody comes over, ay, qué güerito tu bebé, qué bonito, qué güerito, right? Like, even they could be dark skinned, but to say that is somehow helpful, or it makes somebody feel good because you want to get to whiteness. And the family that I I lived in the woman who told me she was no longer indigenous, and she was pretty dark-skinned indigenous woman. She told me she married this white farmer because she wanted to mejorar la raza, no? And so there's all these kind of, oh, and the telenovelas, don't get me started with the telenovelas. Who are the women in the telenovelas who are like the good ones? They're all the blonde, blue eyes, right? And you don't even see Black folks in the telenovelas, very rarely. I saw one, I don't know whether it was Marimar, or, I mean, that's how I learned Spanish, okay? Watching telenovelas. It was something Marimar, I think, and they had like this priest who was Black, actually real Black African, right? That was like the only one I've seen. Maybe I don't watch them anymore, but too many other things to do. But I think it's a really telling part of the everyday experiences of how Blackness is being covered up, right? It's gone. 5 minutes. I got it right here too. Thank you. And so we have this issue of not wanting to talk about race. We have this long-term idea of mestizoism and how that is helping us be stronger. But I really think it's helping us be weaker, because I'm not saying that people should not embrace the different parts of their identity, but by making invisible their certain parts of their identity and rejecting the richness with which we have so much in debt to Africa and Mexico in terms of culture, food, dance. I mean, like, it's so embedded in the culture of Mexico, and there's such a big negation of that when migrants move from Mexico to the United States, it's shocking. And this idea of mestizoism is troubling, because it doesn't explain the experiences that they're having there in the United States. So, like I mentioned, there is still this, in Mexico, a lot of Mexican communities have an anti-Black attitude. So there's lots of tension between African-American communities, even though we might not want to call them American, we want to call them African. We'll see this tomorrow. We had a good conversation in the bus over here, let me tell you. And so I think what's really important is to see how the idea of mestizoism is very challenging for Mexicans in the United States, because while there's this sort of built-in anti-Blackness in mestizoism, and y'all can challenge me on that too if you want, and it goes to the United States, and then you have tensions instead of being able to unite and fight together. I mean, there are definitely Black-Brown collaborations and collective action, but it's a lot of tension. And there's John Bettinker, who's Colombiano, but he was at the university, he's still there, I think he's about to retire. He wrote a book about Black and Brown collaborations in Chicago, and it was really a really tough situation in the city, and lots of fighting, and there were some triumphs, but mostly it was very difficult. And part of that is from, I believe, this idea of mestizoism, which invisibilizes Blackness and makes Blackness, it's anti-Black. And it's maybe not in its origins, but how it has been embraced and sort of come up through culture over the years. And so there's that anti-Blackness that brings, and it creates tension there. And then there's the Mexicans, as I mentioned earlier, like getting lynched. Like, this is a very Black thing to have happen to you, to be lynched. It's still happening now, right? We see the cops killing Black folks all over the place, and they're killing Mexicans all over the place. So, and I'm not suggesting that it's the same experience exactly, that African Americans and Mexican migrants are having the same racial experience, but they're having similar racial experience. And I think it's the Mexicans that I mean, there's this amazing woman that I've been working with, Carmen, in Norristown, which is just outside of Philly. I was at Temple University for 9 years, and I worked in Norristown, which is outside of Philly, and it's one of the big, in quotes, Mexican communities. And she was so embracing of her native roots. She had dresses, she did all kinds of ceremonies. And when we talked about embracing or understanding or even acknowledging the African roots, it was pretty impossible for her to do that. So I feel like there's an opportunity to have, and I know it's happening here in Mexico, a lot of Afro, you can say you're Afro-Mexican now on the census. There's money that would traditionally gone to indigenous communities and now going to African Mexican communities, right? So there's movement, but I think there's so much more that could be done. And if that cultural shift, and I'm not thinking that the Mexican migration is going to completely stop or even really slow down that much, it's just ebbs and flows, right? I think it would have a really interesting impact on the experience of Mexicans in the United States. Thank you. Bruno say he's gonna back me up on this, okay? So yeah.
Thank you, Betsy. Very interesting, especially this year. We are having a lot of anniversaries inside UNAM, our university. I have to say that right now we are competing with the anniversary of the Institute of Social Research. They are celebrating their 95 years. And it's important because it was the very first Institute of Social Sciences, and it's hardly based on indigenous studies. And the thing is that the identity of this university is based on that cosmic race that you talked earlier. And tomorrow, when you go to the central campus, you will see the murals. And the murals are telling that narrative, how this cosmic race was supposed to be the one that will lead the Latin American identity, and how the UNAM has a mission with that race. Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. Well, now we have two more presenters of this panel, and they are both presenting through Zoom. So first of all, I would like to present Dr. Gisele, and I apologize in advance because probably I will mispronounce her last name, Gisele Kleidermacher. And well, I would like to talk a little bit about her. She's a sociologist specializing in transnational South-South migration studies, particularly focusing on Senegalese migrants in Argentina and Brazil. She is a pioneer in the study of Senegalese migration in Argentina, contributing to the understanding of the labor trajectories, social networks, and integration processes. She holds a PhD in social sciences and has extensive experience in research on migration, education, and labor. She participates in national and international research projects in migration, Afrodescendancy, and inequalities, applying innovative methodological approaches. Gisele teaches doctoral seminars at UBA and has been a professor of methodology and sociology of migration in the sociology program for 15 years. She also leads research groups on migration and social inclusion. She is the editor on Revista en Ciencias Empresariales y Sociales, and has collaborated with international organizations such as the International Organization for Migration. Her recent research explored discrimination against migrant students and the dynamics between migrants and natives in school settings. Her latest publication, Microemprendedurismo Callejero, una caracterización de las actividades de personas migrantes de origen senegalés en el área metropolitana de Buenos Aires, appeared in Revista de Estudios del Trabajo. She has also published a book on Senegalese migrants' narratives in Argentina. Gisele, welcome to Mexico. Welcome to UNAM. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I will try to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Is that okay?
Yes. Yes, we can see it now.
Well, good morning, and thank you again. First of all, I'd like to thank PUEA for the invitation and the opportunity to be part of this important event The work I'm presenting today comes from more than 15 years of research carried out in close collaboration with African and Afro-descendant communities in Argentina. While this presentation focuses on African migration in Argentina since 1990s, it's important to recognize that the African presence in the country dates much further back. Between the 16th and 18th century, many Africans were brought to Argentina as slaves. Their contributions to society were made invisible, both physically and historically, throughout 19th and 20th century. Later on, in the early 20th century, Argentina also received migrants from Cabo Verde. And during the 1980s and 1990s, Afro-descendants arrived from Uruguay, Brazil, and Peru. In recent years, African migrants, especially in Buenos Aires, have become more visible. Even though they represent a relatively small group, their racial identity makes them stand out. Their arrival has sparked many questions about who they are and why they come to Argentina. Their presence challenged the country's history of invisibility and helps to make African identities more visible. As many of you know, migration within the African continent has always been common. During colonization, it was often encouraged or even forced by colonial powers. And after decolonization, it increased further. In the 1980s, many African countries experienced strong economic reforms. These changes led to more poverty and weaker states, pushing many people to migrate, first within Africa and later to countries like France, Italy, Spain, and the US. But when those destinations become harder to reach, migration patterns began to shift. Many Africans started moving to countries with no colonial, cultural, or linguistic ties, such as Argentina. In this sense, the country became part of a broader global trend. Migration from Africa countries to this South American nation remains relatively small, with the Senegalese community being the largest. These migration projects are often supported by the migrant's family and involve significant financial investments. Many families have sold vehicles or even land to fund the journey as a way to diversify the income of the extended family back in Senegal. Because of the cost and the distance, those who arrive in Argentina are generally not the most economically disadvantaged. So why Argentina? The first Senegalese migrants arrived in the 1990s, when Argentina had a fixed exchange rate, 1 peso equaled $1, which made it easier to send remittances. At the same time, Argentina had diplomatic offices in Senegal, which facilitate visa access. This changed after 2001 economic crisis. The exchange system collapsed, embassies were closed, and now only 5 remain in all Africa. But by then, migration networks were already in place and arrivals continued and even increased in the following years, especially between 2012 and 2015. Because of limited access to official visas, the journey to Argentina often involves irregular entries. Most migrants travel first to Brazil on a tourist visa and then continue overland, a trip that can take several days, supported by existing Senegalese networks in the region. While many remain in Brazil, those who move to Argentina often cite experiences of racism, work restrictions, or the presence of family or contacts already settled in Argentina. In previous years, some also entered through Ecuador, where visa requirements were lifted, and then crossed Peru and Bolivia by land. This journey can take days and is often made in very difficult conditions. Most Senegalese migrants are young men between 18 and 35 years old. Women usually remain in Senegal, as it's a traditional the men who migrate in search of work while women stay behind to manage extended household responsibilities. Although this is gradually changing in Dakar, it's still uncommon for women to migrate individually to Latin America. As in Senegal, most of them practice a form of Sufi Islam, which incorporates elements of African traditional religions, a syncretic expression often referred to as Black African Islam. They are predominantly Wolof with some Diola and speak Wolof as their main language. French is usually spoken by those who attend public schools, while many others, especially from rural areas, only went to Quranic schools, which is a common tradition in Senegal. Depending on their migration route, some also speak Portuguese or Italian. However, only a minority arrive with fluency in Spanish. According to members of the community, around 5,000 people of Senegalese origin currently live in Argentina. Official data, however, tells a different story. The 2022 national census recorded 1,120 people born in Senegal, making them the largest African-born group in Argentina. But RENAPER, the National Registry of Persons, reported that by August 2023, 2,267 Senegalese nationals had received Argentines IDs. Part of this discrepancy is due to a special 3-month regularization program in 2022. Many were likely missed by the census due to difficulties accessing their housing, mistrust, or limited understanding of the process. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic and Argentinians' recent economic crisis have led some migrants to return to Senegal or move somewhere else. Many have joined migrants' caravans traveling through Central America, while those who managed to obtain an Argentinian passport have tried their luck in the United States, Canada, and Spain. Most Senegalese migrants work in street vending or informal sales. This is often the only option due to the lack of documentation. Street vending requires little startup capital and no Spanish skills. Migrants can be working quickly thanks to strong community networks that offer support, housing, and guidance. They typically sell costume jewelry, sunglasses, or imitation brand sportwear. Informal loans within the community are common and help migrants finance their merchandising or daily expenses. In 2017, we conducted a survey with the Senegalese Association, gathering 300 responses across Argentina. Nearly 90% of participants reported working in street vending. This shows that beyond being a survival strategy, vending is also a space of mutual support, independence, and solidarity. Migration is sustained by strong community ties. Nearly every migrant arrives with a connection, be it a friend, a relative, or someone they know, who provides support during the initial period after arrival. Most live in old hotels, often in poor conditions, sharing rooms with multiple compatriots. Some manage to rent apartments, also share among many. Religious brotherhoods, especially the Murid Dairas, play a central role in the Senegalese migration experience. In every Argentinian province where Senegalese communities have settled, Dairas are active and form a structural part of community life. These groups, which began as informal support networks, are now highly organized. Their weekly gathering not only include the recitation of poems by Sheikh Amadou Bamba, but also serve as spaces of exchange information about sales, strategic selling location, merchandise purchases. Additionally, they coordinate and help finance visits from marabouts, reinforcing both religious and social cohesion. Senegalese migrants have also created informal associations, such as the Association of Senegalese Residents in Argentina, or ARSA. The group provides support with visa processes, legal matters, and maintains relationships with both Argentinian authorities and Senegalese government. Since there is no Senegalese embassy in Argentina, ARSA collaborates closely with the embassy based in Brazil. It also facilitates passports renewal and played an active role in the special regularization programs launched by Argentinian government in 2013 and 2022. One of its most significant responsibilities is organizing the repatriation of deceased community members who are typically buried in Senegal. Meanwhile, Carambenor, an association of women from Casamance, holds monthly gatherings to recreate everyday life from their village. They also host fundraising events with Argentinian guests, supporting projects back in Senegal like purchasing water pumps.
You have 5 minutes left.
Right. Ties to Senegal remain strong. Migrants send money and gifts through travelers and stay connected through phone calls, social media, and online platforms. Many follow news, sports, and religious events like Grand Magal through Senegalese online media. They live in several Argentinian cities, working during the week and traveling to fair markets, festivals, and beach circuits on weekends and holidays. Some move between Argentina and Brazil and occasionally return to Senegal. There are YouTube channels, such as Tuba Argentine TV, dedicated to broadcasting community events and religious celebrations in Argentina to other Senegalese communities around the world. The circulation of goods, traditional values, and even protective amulets known as gris-gris further reflects the strength on these transnational networks. But the community has also faced serious challenges. In Buenos Aires, they've been repeatedly targeted by police under the excuse of controlling street vending. These operations are often violent, involving arbitrary arrest, lack of translators, and confiscation of goods. Even without charges, such experiences worsen legal uncertainty and reinforce exclusion. In response, this community has taken a strong and visible political stance. They've organized marches against police violence, joined Afro-descendant groups to denounce institutional racism, and launched grassroots initiatives like Spanish classes for new immigrants. These actions go beyond survival. They reflect a broader fight for recognition, rights, and dignity. Public demonstrations by African and Afro-descendant community, especially in central Buenos Aires, a city historically imagined as white, have helped bring state racism into the national spotlight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for sharing this situation of the Senegalese in Argentina. Especially, I found very interesting that the last part where the society is taking action and they are creating their support groups as in demonstrations. Let's move on to our last presenter today. I would like to introduce Dr. Alethia Fernández de la Reguera. Today she will be presenting the topic, the militarization and encroaching of borders in Mexico. Alethia Fernández de la Reguera is Associate Professor at the Institute of Legal Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and coordinator of UNAM's National Laboratory on Diversities. She's a visiting scholar at the University of Warwick Law School with the project, The Effects of Border Militarization in Mexico and Poland on the International Protection and Human Rights of Migrants. In 2021, she received the National University Distinction Award for Young Scholars 2021 in the area of social science research. She is affiliate of faculty at the University of Arizona teaching at the MA in Human Rights Practice and a member of the Border Criminologists Network at the University of Oxford and of the editorial committee of the journal Feminist Legal Studies at the University of Newcastle. She's a specialist in gender and migration, immigration detention, bureaucracies, state violence, gender-based violence, and women's anatomy. Alethia, it's great to have you back at PUEA. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vania. I'm very happy to be with you, even if it's online, and to share part of my most recent research on militarization of borders. I'll try to connect my presentation with the previous presentations. And before I start sharing my screen and formally with my presentation, I would like to say that the idea is to present like a context of securitization and criminalization of migration in Mexico. is not a research that is particularly focused on African migrants, but is a research that shows the level of racial profiling in immigration controls and how the most vulnerable populations in transit in Mexico are indigenous people and also Afro-descendant people and African migrants. So if it's okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So, I mean, within Latin America, Mexico is a country that has like the highest numbers of detention centers. Mexico has been replicating like the most criminalizing policies of the global north. And unfortunately, Mexico now has one of the highest numbers in the world of detained people. And this is related to a very important policy on the militarization of borders that usually we think that militarization started in the year 2019 with the deployment of the National Guard, but actually we have been like witnessing more than 3 decades of militarization of both borders, Mexico and the US, and Mexico and the border with Guatemala. And my research is based on the south of Mexico. Since 2017, I have been conducting institutional ethnographies and participant observations in immigration detention centers and also in places of outside in offices of immigration regulation and in checkpoints. And this part of my research that I'm presenting today is particularly to understand how the concept of border and the concept of securitization has expanded, no? And it's not only immigration control practices are not only happening in border areas, but we also have very serious cases of human rights violations in a context of immigration control inside the Mexican territory. So as I was saying before, Mexico has one of the largest immigration detention systems of the world, has more than 50 centers along the territory. You are seeing 2 maps. The first map, all the blue dots are immigration detention centers along the territory. And if we see in the last 5 years, Mexico has been breaking records every year on the numbers of detained migrants. And last year, almost between January and August 2024, we had almost 1 million people that were detained, from which almost 720,000 were taken to immigration detention centers, and a very small percentage were channeled to to government shelters. We know that around 30% of immigration detentions occur in the southern border, and therefore we can talk about detention as a main deterrent strategy of the Mexican government, not only deportation, but previously detention. So we talk about arbitrary detention, which I connect detention with the study of punishment, and maybe I don't have time to talk about that today, but it's not only the experience of being detained, but the experience of being punished and the experience of sometimes even very serious human rights violations during detentions. So we're talking about Black populations, we're talking about racialized populations in transit in Mexico, and I think it's very important first to understand the context of immigration control in the country. And it's important to bring up the case of a ruling that passed in 2022 in the Supreme Court of Justice. And it is a very important case because today in Mexico, immigration controls inside the territory are unconstitutional. And this is a case that is showing much of what has been discussed this morning about racial profiling and racism as an institutional practice. And this is a case that happened in 2015. It's a case that shows racial profiling. These were 3 indigenous Mexican Tzeltal people that were traveling from Chiapas to the north of Mexico to work on the fields. They were detained in the center of the country, in the state of Querétaro. They didn't speak Spanish. and they were detained, and the authorities, they did not validate their IDs. They didn't believe that they were Mexicans. They were detained, and they were going to be deported to Guatemala. Before deportation, they were taken to an immigration detention center where one of them was tortured. And this case was identified, and they were not deported. And this case was brought to the Supreme Court of Justice, and it established the unconstitutionality of immigration checks because it is against the human right to move freely in the country, and it attends to the right of not being discriminated against in Mexico. So I'm just giving this as a very important context because we can also discuss the gaps that exist between rules or laws in books and the implementation of securitization policies. So I'm presenting very briefly part of my research, the most recent fieldwork that I conducted in 2022 and 2023, trying to document actions of immigration control when the National Guard is involved. I conducted observation in different places, in checkpoints, in immigration detention centers, and in informal camps. I have interviews with people on the move that interacted with the National Guard during detention, and also I conducted 10 in-depth interviews with NGOs that provided psycholegal services to migrants who were detained by the Army or by the National Guard, and who suffered serious human rights violations during detention. So my point here is to understand just the stage of checkpoints. Mexico is a country with a proliferation of checkpoints. Everyone who has traveled in Mexican highways mostly have been through this experience of being detained through a different checkpoint. And so therefore my research here is just to analyze this particular stage and to understand that checkpoints have become a very important mechanism to control the territory, especially in the context of criminal violence and the war against drugs. So it's interesting because that checkpoint has different functions in terms of policing and also in terms of immigration control. So we can talk about the internalization and externalization of borders, but also individualization of borders. For the Mexican case, I would talk about internalization, how borders can enlarge, can move in a very flexible way through the checkpoints, and also individualization, how certain profiles are more are special targets for detention. So checkpoints has become a very important power dispositive that enables controls, that is flexible, is adaptable to the needs of policing and the needs of immigration control, as I was mentioning. And my argument is that checkpoints have become a violent infrastructure where different actors are participating in. So this is the most important aspect. And when we talk about, and maybe Bruno has much more information than me in regards of African population moving throughout the country, but it's important to understand that checkpoints are not only operated by the National Institute of Migration, but we have multiple actors that operate checkpoints. So we can have state actors, we can have the army, for example, we can have extra legal actors like the municipal police, that they don't have the right to operate checkpoints in federal areas, but we also have criminal actors. And sometimes in the same checkpoints, we have the coexistence of all these different actors that are operating. Why? Because we are in talking about territories that are securitized, and they are also extra surveilled, So at the end, what is happening is that checkpoints expose migrants to racialized and gender forms of extreme violence. As I was saying, in my experience, in my fieldwork, I have documented the existence of legal, extra-legal, and criminal actors in checkpoints, and therefore the most vulnerable, of course, will be racialized migrants. So I think this part I'm going to go fast because I prefer to explain the contribution of my research. I know I have 5 minutes left. 5 minutes, yes, I'm almost done. So the contribution of my research is to show that the Global South presents different categories or different ways to understand that checkpoint. So it's not sufficient to understand checkpoint as a mechanism to control borders or to control territory, but we need to understand the coexistence, as I was saying, of legal, extra-legal, and criminal actors, and the different purposes of a checkpoint. What we're seeing very often is that the most common situations are that people are stopped in buses, people on the move. They are usually men that are taken out of the buses, and even though they express their desire to ask for asylum, they are detained. Many times they are deported. Sometimes they are also, we have cases of temporary forced disappearance because people are for example, they destroy their documents, they confiscate their mobile phones. They are sometimes for hours, sometimes even could be 10, 12 hours that they are uncommunicated in hidden areas. So we are seeing very often practices that the military use to control the territory that are being now used for immigration control. And of course, racial profiling is super common, no? Because we are seeing that the most vulnerable populations are Black people and indigenous people, Mexican or migrants, that experience detentions during checkpoints in a very particular way. We are, for example, identifying that the length of the delay during the checkpoint, the type of searches, the property that is damaged. These are cases that are more serious, or the people face higher risks when they are irregular migrants and racialized migrants. And just to finish my presentation, to say that the most common aspects that we are documenting, as I was saying, we have very long times between the moment that people are arrested and when they are taken to detention centers. We are seeing cases of extortion. We are seeing cases of temporal disappearances. And one of the most risky situations is, as the military are the ones in charge of controlling the territory, there is a lack of accountability on how these operations are taking place. And NGOs, who traditionally have been monitoring human rights in these zones, in these areas, have very limited access. And I think I finish here, and I prefer to have more time to discuss during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alethia, for presenting us your research. It's overwhelming to hear how we always take for granted that the position of the government is that for some reason the immigrants should not be here. Like if we were only taking into account the short run, instead of maybe looking for the long run and how can we help those immigrants to get to places that they want. You were talking about vulnerability and victimization of the immigrants. So I just can't help but wonder, like, who could protect them, especially in a government where the citizens of Mexico don't always will rely on it. How could an immigrant could rely that Mexican government will help and protect their rights? Thank you very much. So today, this morning, and well, the beginning of the afternoon, we have this really interesting conversation, very international, I have to say. It's amazing to see like the profiles of all of you, taking into account your background, the place that you work right now, and even your current geographic location. So let's start with a round of questions. There are some questions from the social media. So the first question is for Bruno. I don't have the name. It's a question from YouTube, and they would like to know if you know what kind of economic activity is the most usual for African migrants in Mexico. Yes, let's go by one, and then we come back. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. It's very diverse. I mean, people in waiting, they usually rely on remittances from everywhere. That's we know that diasporic networks are more complex than migratory networks because they are multipolar, right? So people rely on remittances from kinship remittances from Europe, from Africa, from Argentina and Brazil. But when this is not enough, they usually are employed in Tapachula by these coffee producers. We know that this Tapachula is located in a zone of coffee production. And here in Mexico, I have seen them selling candies, working on gas stations. And the northern border, I have seen African and Asian migrants working in maquilas. Wouldn't know how to translate maquilas. Help me, Betsy. Industrias maquiladoras.
Yeah, manufacturing.
Manufacturing plants. So it's very varied. It depends on if they have, there's a Mexican document called CURP, which allows you to get a formal job. And in order to have a CURP, you've got to have your asylum, your refuge in Mexico. It's a refuge application initiated. So if you ask for refuge in Mexico, you can get a CURP and start searching for a formal job. But I mean, this allocations, these labor insertions, they are very, very diverse. I would say, yeah.
Thank you, Bruno. So I would like to take some questions, maybe from the audience here. Professor Stein, we will bring you the microphone.
Thank you very much for four very rich and I think complementary presentations. Really dealing, I think, with the whole notion of the projection internally and externally of identity, of people of African descent. But I think what I'd like to actually pose is a discussion of the big elephant in the room, which is Trump and the Trump policies and its impact on the pressures and tensions that's created in each of these societies, Argentina, Mexico. Right now, Trump is in the process of actually shipping out African refugees to Panama, which is the country that's accepted them. And the question now becomes, what impact does he have in actually then putting pressure on increasing militarization towards refugees of African descent? What impact does that have in the dynamics of the discussions of identity inside the Latin American societies and the tolerance of the presence of Africans in these societies? I'd like to sort of talk a bit about that dynamic and how that plays out throughout Latin America and in the whole issue of the impact of African migration. My second question has to do with from the other side, the kind of pull and push factors associated with migration in Latin America. And how does that change the underlying conceptualization of immigrants simply as being here as an entry point into the United States when that gets closed off? And then that then puts pressure locally on how to deal with the increasing presence of Africans. Does that actually slow down the migration process? In terms of the underlying pull factors. And then, of course, one else has to talk about the push factors coming from the African countries themselves. So I'd like to have this whole discussion of this dynamic that's occurring in these societies that's arising from the overall broader context and its impact on African migration.
Would you like to answer? No? Or maybe someone from through Zoom, Alethia or Gisele,
I mean, I think these are big questions, no?
Okay, go ahead, Betsy, please.
Yes. Okay.
That-
So
No, go ahead.
Okay, let's start with Alethia, and then we come back to Betsy.
I'm sorry. Yes. No, I was just thinking that these are big questions what you are raising. Thank you for the discussion. I mean, there is. I think we need to understand like this that we have experienced 3 decades of militarization of both borders. Maybe in the northern border it started a bit earlier, but clearly since the late 80s and the 90s we started to have a process that created not only infrastructure, but it created different expertise and the type of operations. We used to have, at least in the case of Mexico, more like hidden operations. And in the last 6 years, it openly, militarization started to control migration, because we also need to understand the context of militarization of public security in Mexico. It's not that the National Guard is only in charge of migrants. The National Guard is in charge of many things in Mexico. It's a country that has militarized the police. It's a country that has also taken budget, taken resources from the police, and now the investment is in the armed forces. So certainly Trump adds pressure into this process. And what I think that what's going to happen and is that maybe we are going to have more cases of people that come to Mexico and Mexico become an undesired destination. And this is something that clearly has been happening for the last at least 6-7 years, that Mexico, with the borders closed in the US, we started to see this even before in 2018 with the Central American caravans, and then with the pandemic and all the different policies of externalization of securitization and asylum that the US started to impose at least for two administrations now, are proving that Mexico is an undesired destination. And I think that this will put more pressure in the northern states. I am not conducting fieldwork in the northern states, but certainly we have a lot of colleagues and our activist colleagues that are talking about this overwhelming of there are no enough services, there are no enough shelters, no enough responses to cope with the crisis. No. But I don't have anything particular to say about what is currently happening, because I'm not doing fieldwork at the moment. But I think we are going to be the accentuation of processes that have been there for a long time. And it's important to understand militarization in the longer term as a continuum, I think.
Thank you, Alethia. Betsy, please.
So I guess for me, it's a rather new phenomenon. Trump, exactly. Obviously, we know that this has been going on for a long time. But what I see, I work a lot in Chicago still. I lived in Chicago for 20 years, kind of my second home. And what I've seen is that the response in particularly Mexican migrant communities, and particularly with women in Chicago who are scared and who are being traumatized by all of this, that their reaction is to heal, like to really figure out how they can care for each other and heal from all of this that's going on, and set up systems of support, getting people to go to get notarized documents that say that if I am deported, that my kids will go here. And so there's a whole, there's phone trees, although it's more just like chat groups. A lot of people are using Signal, including in our government, to set up ways to communicate quickly, to react quickly. But this issue of healing and a culture of care seems to be an emerging, it's been there for a while, but it seems to be on steroids right now. And that's what I'm seeing sort of in reaction to Trump at this moment. It's not exactly it is identity, because it's an identity of being Mexican, but it's not specifically racialized in the way that I see things happening. I think people are just everyone's scared to death. I get phone calls all the time of, can I put you on my bank account so that if I get deported, that you would be able to get the money and send it to me? And there's just a lot of fear. And so I think the reaction that I see, and it's limited, it's not like I'm, doing a broad study or anything. It's a very micro kind of understanding of things. Is really about caring and healing and being prepared for the worst.
Thank you, Betsy. Yes, Professor, please. We will bring you the microphone.
Hello, my name is Onyeka Kamwelue from Nigeria. Thank you for your presentation. And you kept looking at me when you were talking. Same thing with him. I get that reaction when I go for conferences like this. What is the color of the microphone in front of you?
There's many colors, but black is the dominant.
Where's the color? Okay.
Depend.
No, this is black. That's black.
And it has silver.
Okay, the speaker where you have the mic.
This is black, and then there's
okay. That's
blue.
fine. That's fine. That's fine. And this is what? The color of the paper.
Which paper? This?
Yeah. No. The paper you're holding.
Black and white.
No. The color of the paper.
Oh, okay, white.
White. I spent 3 years in Oxford trying to find out why Africans are called black people. What's the color of my skin? In African religions, the color black symbolizes negativity. In African homes, especially in Nigeria, in Igbo land where I come from, if you see a black cat, it means evil.
Mm-hmm.
Everything about black represents evil and negativity. The people who started calling Africans black knew exactly what they were doing, and they chose to call themselves white people. Meanwhile, their skin color is not white. There is nothing about them that is white.
Mm-hmm.
And that was why I wrote this book, There Are No White People. Now, my question is, why do intellectuals like you propagate the colorization of Africans and still think that countries like Argentina wouldn't want to erase Africans because of the colorization of their skin color when he's not black? Not even the Senegalese in Argentina are black. So my question is, why do intellectuals like you continue to have this conversation and still interject the color black to Africans, please?
That's a great question. And I don't think that I come from looking at a Black Power movement in the United States. So it's something that I have been studying and working with African and self-identified Black folks in the United States. Right, I agree. I totally agree. And there's a lot of people talking about Black and brown, but there's lots of different shades of brown. But I think the idea is to challenge that Black is negative. I mean, there's a whole Black is beautiful movement. And there has been a change over time of how people were named. And this was something that the Black Power movement, the civil rights movement embraced this identity and challenged the negativeness that was associated with it. So it's an evolving thing. People went from being called colored to being called African descendant to being called, there's a lot of people have different understandings of how they themselves being called. Right. Okay. but they were also embracing this. In the Black Power movement, there was an embracing of this idea of Blackness as beautiful.
Because they were not brave enough like me to ask for it.
That is possibly the truth. I could agree with that. But that's how in the Africana Studies program that I have been a part of.
The Africana studies were set up by people like you.
No, not where I was. Mm-mm.
They were set up by the so-called white people.
Not the case at University of Massachusetts, Boston. It's not the
The
case.
institutions were set up by people.
Well, I would like to make some comments first. Bruno, it inspires me how our environment is changing with all the migration. And it is incredible, all these people that are coming from other countries and how they are making their food, what they sell, whatever. Many years ago, well, it was in 20, I was, I don't know, it was 2005, 2006. We won a project of Mexican entrepreneurs migration in the USA. And one of the things that we know how the Mexican food and all the restaurants of the Mexicans are all around in the south part of USA, but also in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in New York, and all that. So it inspires me when I was seeing your pictures, because it is the same, no? How all this migration penetrates the culture and how it's changing, no? The environment. Another thing that I would like to say, well, I impressed about Alethia's conference because I never thought we have a lot of checkpoints and how the government is trying to stop this migration. But as in the last part, your conclusion is that now Mexico is going to be the alternative for all these people that are coming from Africa, Asia, and also the Triangle of the North, and also from other parts. So we don't have any economic policy to avoid that, no? And most of the problems, even in the conference of CELAC, that it was, I think, was 2 or 3 years ago, Alethia Bárcenas said that all this migration of Central America is how all these American companies, these transnational companies, spoil the environment. So that's why, because also another concept that I learned is that, how to say, climate change migration. So this is incredible how we have moved, how we have spoiled the environment and how these people are trying to find a job. And at the end is because this is the result of a policy where we can have a policy of full employment. And only this policy of full employment, this is a post-Keynesian view, an heterodox view, as Howard said before. We have to think with an heterodox economic science. We just can't continue with neoclassical policy. And another thing that I want to tell Betsy, I have a friend, I think this comment I made it 1 year ago when we have the African colloquium, or I know, and it was in the African Day, I think. I belong to the feminist economists, and I belong also to the Association of Social Economics, ASA. And my friend Barbara Hopkins was the president, and they invited me to the plenary of ASA. And she invites one American, but she was from Korea, Korean American. She invites one from India, but American Indian, and she invited an American, but she was, I don't know how to say, because we can say negra, o sea, it was color. And when she invited everybody, she said, oh, this is the first time we have 4 women color in the plenary. And I said, I never feel that I was a woman color. But that's right, because, well, I am not white, of course. But this is how Americans is a cultural problem of the American, because, you know, we don't have in our population census, we don't say if you are, now I think we have African, ¿cómo se dice? African. Si descendemos de African, no? But this was a policy, no? You are, even if your characteristics is indigenous, or if you have some Chinese or Oriental, whatever, in the census, you don't have that. And so it was very terrible, because I began talking, because it was the problem of George Floyd, that you know what I am talking about. And the question is why economists never said something about George Floyd, because this was an economic problem. And so that's why the plenary, I read the statement of one economist about this question, why economists don't say anything about George Floyd. So for me, I just can't say that in Mexican, we have like a race problem, because we don't have the census. And in that conference, it was incredible using the census. Then you are going to see that the people of color, they have less opportunities to have high CEOs or whatever. No? So what is this? Is economic policies. And if you see public education in USA, it's really terrible. If you live in a very high income condado, no, colony, or whatever, then you are going to have a very good education for your children. But if you live just maybe 3, 4, 10 blocks, if that colonia don't pay huge taxes, then they won't have better professors. And so that's a problem of economic policies. And then you see how you see this difference but in the thing of USA. I think this is a cultural problem. And the last thing that I want to tell you, well, I have a grandson, Emiliano. And Emiliano is the same color as me. But he goes to school where everybody is white. And they have a problem, because I don't know what happened. And one of the boy, 11 years, said, "Stop, Negro boy." It was a huge problem, because of course, all the parents, and it was terrible. And the boy that said that was expulsado of the school. So I think this race, the only way to be less is economic policies. And because for me is that, because for example, if you go to the school, in a French school, my daughter, it was in the second and third, well, she went to the French school, to the Liceo Francés in Dallas. Very different colors of the people. And you don't have that race problem as much as in the public schools of USA. So it depends, because in France, you have more an open in the school. Well, that's my experience. Maybe I'm wrong. The French school in
Dallas, Texas, or
Yes.
in
No, it was
in Dallas,
the
Texas?
Liceo Francés.
Huh.
And they don't have any problem if you are white, color, whatever. It's very different.
Hmm.
But in this public school, it's terrible. And also we have a lot of Mexicans because they don't have enough money. It's really a problem with all the migrants in USA.
Well, I kind of feel like we need to go back to the first talk today and think about all the structures of the economy. And it's very convenient to have different groups who can be exploited, and race, starting with the slave trade, colonialism, structural adjustment, all of that keeps in place ways that some people are have advantages and some people don't, right? And so that is what makes the system continue. If everyone was equal, everybody had equal opportunities, then that system would fall apart. So I think an example of one school where you think that there aren't race problems, and I would doubt that was actually the case. Maybe on the surface it might look like that. I would be very skeptical. I would want to go and sort of have deep conversations with folks to see what, if there was, everything was hunky-dory, I would find that a little bit odd in the United States, right? And of course, my frame of reference is growing up in the 1960s in New York City during the civil rights activities. And so for me, there is no justification for racism, right? There's no, there's been lots of people, that guy Huntington and whoever did all these, biological studies trying to find some sort of differences, which is all crazy. But this was a structure that was set up that really goes back to how we can exploit certain people under certain pretense that have no basis. So maybe it is all about economics, but I think obviously there's a long, few 500-year history of how that's been set in place. So I don't know how we get out of it, but I think that understanding it more broadly, but also how it's, we got to go from the macro to the micro and back and forth continually to sort of get a handle on where we need to go from here. And a lot of, 65% of Mexicanos or Latino, let's say generally Latinos in the census, check off white. There is now a mixed race block, but in the census, it's white, pink, black, brown, Asian, or Native. Oh, yeah. My husband always writes in Aztec/Black. So
When they ask you what color you are, well, I don't know.
yeah, I mean, we go back to the casta charts, right? 16 different tones, right? So I think that it's obviously, I mean, I was writing a paper, and this is for a chapter for a book. I don't know if it was Netherlands or somewhere. And we were talking about, I mean, in the paper, it was a co-authored chapter, and they said, we cannot use the word Black. Nope, can't use that. And we had documented, it was a comparison of the US and Spain women, migrant women. And the women told us, they were told by their boss that they were being fired because they did not want any Black people in that office. And this was in Spain. And so we were like, yeah, we get it. This is all constructed. It does this bullshit, but this is what they told us. And so eventually they allowed us to have that quote from the participant in there, but there, it is totally up for debate. It's not, there's nothing that's finalized on this issue. And I hope that the way I present things is to be asking questions. I am not an expert, right? And I'm an outsider here in Mexico. So I feel like we still have a long way to go to really think more deeply about these things and get to a place where, you know, different people are going to feel comfortable with different things, but we agree to engage in the dialogue.
See, we still have some minutes, and I would like to bring attention to Gisele's presentation. And so the question that Professor Stein did was a very good one because it's about current issues. So my question for Gisele is the same. Like, Gisele, what's your opinion about Milei's policies regarding immigration, particularly African immigration?
I was listening to you, very interesting, the debate. About the US policy, I think now Argentina is having, you know, right policy. they went for the left, for the right. So right now, African people is leaving the country. They are not coming to Argentina. It's not a receiving country right now. They are going mostly for, they are trying to go to US, but most of them, they can't. They try to apply for different refugee status in different places, but they can't get this kind of visas, this kind of, in Argentina we call precaria. It's a precaria, it's a document, it lasts for 3 months. But right now I think that's what, I don't know what.
Your microphone, please. Because we cannot hear you. Could you speak closer to your mic?
I'm sorry, because I have no internet in my computer right now, so I'm from my iPhone.
No, that way is perfect. We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. So what I was saying is that we have a right policy with Milei. Milei wants to have a similar policy like Trump. So we are not receiving migrants right now. They don't want to come here. Most African people don't want to come to Argentina. They are leaving the country. They were leaving the country before Milei, but now the ones that are here, it's not an, it's a lose-lose situation because the economic situation is bad and they can't get the documents, so they are leaving the country. And about the discussion you were talking right now, I was thinking about our census because we, as I tried to put it in my presentation very, very shortly, but we consider a white country, and we since the 19th century, we didn't have this question in the census about how do you identify yourself. Now we are having this question about Afro-descendancy. The question was very hard to define because some African associations and Afro-descendants were saying that it was racist to put negro, but also some people identify themselves as Afro-indigenous people. So I think it's a very difficult situation because some people are afraid to talk about it as they feel like racist, but also if you don't talk about it, you are denying a reality. So I think we have to talk more about this. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Gisele. Well, I would like to say thank you again to our 4 panelists for this very interesting topic. And we are finishing today's academic activities. Tomorrow, please come back. We will have 2 more panels, Africa and South-South cooperation between Latin America and the Caribbean. And after that, we will have the panel Afro-American Contemporary Arts. So for today, that will be all. Thank you very much for your attention and see you tomorrow.